in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. I'm here with me and Djene Bajalan, the maker of the video that you just watched. And a lot of other things. You are on the TIR crew, and now you are the managing editor for Sublation magazine?
That is correct. I am on the TIR crew, and I managing edit Sublation magazine, which you can check out at www.sublationmag.com. And also our Twitter and our Facebook and things like that. So, yeah, that's kind of the projects that I'm involved in at the moment, and having an interesting time doing them.
So what is the goal of Sublation magazine? Why does Sublation Media need a magazine?
Well, that is a good question. It's an idea that kind of evolved. For people who don't know, after Zero Books was sold, obviously the old team that was running it, led by the intrepid leader Doug Lane and everybody else who was in that group, obviously they weren't going to work there anymore, and there was an idea to set up a publishing house, and that got some funding and was underway. But of course, you know, the success of the old Zero Books channel also meant that, you know, one of the things we were thinking about was, you know, what other avenues of media could we be involved in? And one of the ideas that sort of percolated up was the idea of having an online magazine, which would be a place where, you know, in a practical sense, where new people who don't, you know, who haven't written before could have an opportunity to write and participate, and also to serve as a kind of general open forum for left publication. And the reason that I think we felt that would be something useful was that kind of thing doesn't really exist. I think you could say Cosmonaut perhaps is a bit like that, but in general, most publications have either a soft or a hard political line. And what we wanted to do was to have different tendencies of the left publishing together, and, you know, try and get ideas in dialogue with one another in the broadest possible sense. Put it another way, you know, coming from the TIR background, you know, the philosophy behind TIR, as we've often said, is to be a non-sectarian show. That doesn't mean we're necessarily anti-sectarian. I think there's a distinction between non-sectarian and anti-sectarian. I mean, I think non-sectarian within the context of media, something like TIR and something like Sublation, is that we don't have a sectarian political line, because everybody involved in managing the magazine has different politics, and we try and take an ecumenical approach to who is and who is not part of the left. Obviously, you know, there will be tendencies and individuals who we all agree for better or worse part of the left, and then there might be some issues where there is some difference over whether an individual is part of the left. But we try to be as open as possible and take the broadest possible approach to, you know, who we would include in being in the left tradition to be a part of this left, let's say, forum for publishing. But like I said, that's not anti-sectarian, because of course anti-sectarian is a different proposition entirely and as a political proposition, I think it's appropriate for media outlets to try and be broadly non-sectarian if they're not tied specifically to a political program or political organization. So that's kind of I would say, the general philosophy behind it. And obviously within the editorial team, there are, I would say, different left tendencies. I always say I'm a social democrat, although I don't even know really what that means. It just means I don't have a particular political movement I'm affiliated with necessarily. And then obviously there's Spencer Leonard, who is, as you know, a member of the Platypus Affiliated Society. So there's a kind of, I would say, I don't know how you would describe them, but I guess they would describe themselves as Leninists, probably.
Yeah.
That's, which is basically they're kind of Trotskyists, I would say, to a certain degree. And then obviously there's Alfie Baun, who's more out of the kind of left populist labor tradition, the Corbyn era. And then there's Ashley Frowley, who, I mean, politically speaking, is a little bit of an enigma, but she's like a very dedicated Marxist, even though I think, some of her political positions might be quite controversial amongst people who we conventionally, for better or worse, see as being on the left. But everybody in the group is, kind of committed to having this open forum. And we have a number of people who are contributing editors, including Stephen Bertram Lee, who was who went to Syria to fight alongside the YPG. There's Pascal Robert, of course, who people I'm sure know, who comes out of a militant, I would say, black left tradition. And then Cuba, Deep State Cuba, who of course is our deep state social democrat, I would say. So there's a kind of mix of people who are involved, including Doug Lane himself as well, who, as we all know, Doug Lane is a liberal idealist in Marxist clothing. But so I think that the general idea is not really to have so much of a political line, but to try and publish things that are interesting and thought-provoking. Sometimes that will work, sometimes that will not work, and obviously having such a broad approach inevitably will alienate probably everybody. But I think it's kind of worthwhile, at least to have a try, to have some kind of left forum in which you can have everybody from, I don't know, like a Harvey K style right-wing social democrat to an anarchist feeling comfortable to submit and publish to. Of course, you are one of our authors.
I am. I wrote a piece attacking the Bernie 2024 tendency, which probably upset a few of my social democratic friends. Also got me some new eyes, some of which I'm not entirely comfortable with, but that's a whole different discussion. Yeah, I mean, I've been involved with several broad-based, socialist forum magazines in the past. I edited for North Star magazine, named after Peter Comejo's tendency in magazine in the 70s, that was affiliated loosely with Louis Project and the Marxist and the Philly Socialist, as well as there were all kinds of tendencies brought on there. We commissioned the infamous Mark Fisher piece, The Vampire Castle, and responses to it, and that site's gone and it's kind of in the internet history now. We also were the last we weren't the last editorial group to run that magazine either. When we handed it back to Louis Project, he appointed a couple of different editorial teams, but ultimately the site was not maintained. It's an interesting venture. I mean, one thing I will say is Sublation, because of its prior association with Zero, because of Doug's prior association with Zero, seems to have taken a lot of the people around there with him, but also there's a lot of other people there. I mean, people will know that, yeah, there's a fair amount of platypus affiliated people writing for it, but there's all kinds of people writing for it. That's interesting. It also writes on a variety of there's all kinds of topics on it. So there is that.
Yeah, I think the obviously, if you're going to have people who come from different tendencies in the left and who have different scholarly interests, I mean, everybody in the main editorials team is an academic or trained academic with different areas of interest. That leads to a kind of diversity of topics. Alfie, for example, is very much into his Lacanian psychoanalysis and Marxism discourse, and obviously that's reflected again because Spencer is a platypus affiliated society person. There are platypus affiliated society people writing for us, and then obviously there are the people I know, there are the people Ashley knows, as well as other people who just submit to us in the open submissions process. So there's like a lot of ambition behind what we would like to do. Obviously, with left publishing, there's never any money in it. But one of the things that we want to do is perhaps be a little bit more global and cover different parts of the world. We've tried publishing things about not America. Although I will say, often the articles we publish about things that are not to do with America don't do very well. But I think, publishing them is still worthwhile. I think people should be exposed to things happening in different parts of the world. And,
that's true on my show too. When we do history or niche things on different regions of the world, they're not the lowest watch shows that I do, but they're also not the highest by any stretch of the imagination. So
yeah, I mean,
not
I think
entirely surprising.
It's not surprising, but I still think it's worth putting that stuff out there. I think it's it's interesting in and of itself, and I think people should educate themselves on different parts of the world to understand what's going on. So that's something else that we're trying to do. Another thing that's hopefully happening very soon is we're going to start having a print edition as well, which it won't have everything that's in the online magazine, but there'll be a selection of both things that we've published in online, some of the more important pieces, and also some original content. And I think the objective there is precisely to avoid what you mentioned with North Star, is that sometimes these things can be ephemeral, and having things, interesting pieces written down, I think is quite important. Having things printed, like one of the most important things I think we published, and I'm sure lots of people would disagree with me, even on the editorial team, but from my perspective, I think one of the most interesting thing we published was an interview with the 99 zu 1 guys. They did an interview with some Russian Marxists who had a very interesting analysis of, Ukraine, Russia, and the Ukraine war.
It made nobody happy.
Which made nobody happy, but it was it both kind of, it obliterated the quote unquote tanky arguments about Russia, anti-imperialism, and what have you, while at the same time not slipping into kind of liberal pro-Ukrainian interventionism as well. It had a very nuanced and thoughtful Marxist analysis of Russia, its place in the world, its relationship with its neighbors, and all those, attendant facts. So I thought that was kind of an interesting voice that we were able to publish.
Yeah, there are several Russian leftists that are either expatriates in America or are still in Russia that are even support Varn blog. Some of them have had to find some interesting ways to stay subscribed in the beginning of the conflict. But the one thing I could say is, as I've gone to them, what I've gotten is more similar to what the Nanuns guys got from the Russian Marxists, and not what I see in the U.S. discourse, which seems to be picking State Departments to project. I mean, most of it, honestly, is, as Ben Burgess has rightly said, sounds like most of the U.S. left has, social democratic left sounds vaguely like Christopher Hitchens did around Iraq, but about Ukraine. But then there's also people who invert that and sound to me very similar to the old Spartacist critical support for Al-Qaeda line in regards to supporting the Putin line, although it's probably more of those than there were people arguing that
for
pro.
Well, I think, that was another piece we published from Ben Burgess about Christopher Hitchens, which I think, in my opinion, I think
it's probably the best thing he's wrote about Christopher Hitchens, honestly.
I think it's one of the most interesting things that he's written about Christopher Hitchens. I really think it's one of his best pieces of writing so far this year. Ben writes a lot. I follow what Ben does, and I really was really proud to be able to publish that piece because I thought it was a very insightful piece that linked back to the work he's been doing on Christopher Hitchens, and I think it was an astute observation.
I kind of wish it was in the Hitchens book, but the Hitchens book was released before this happened.
Yeah, I think it would have, if the Hitchens book was being submitted today, that definitely would have been a really good introduction to the book. It's because it really sort of had a kind of relevance. Mm-hmm. And I hope people are reading the Hitchens book because as much as people kind of dog on Hitchens now, like Hitchens was one of those figures who was kind of a big deal on the left in the 80s and 90s, who was was well respected because of his critiques of Clintonism, his opposition to the first Iraq War, and his iconoclasm in absolutely taking apart some of the icons of sort of liberal Western society, from Mother Teresa to Bill and Hillary Clinton, right?
Yeah. I think, what is interesting about Sublation from my standpoint, there are a few magazines I work with people from a lot. Work with a lot of people from Strange Matters, which is vaguely left. They call themselves libertarian socialist friendly. That phraseology kind of makes me cringe, to be honest. But I like their work most of the time. I work a lot with people who around Emancipation Network, which used to be a journal. It has not been a journal in a long time, but it was one. And then I work occasionally with people around Cosmonaut Magazine. And I work with a lot of Sublation lofters. A lot of people on your roster have been on my show, partly because of the prior relationship with Zero, but not just that. I mean, for example, Reed Kane and I know each other, and he's a regular. He's not just on your magazine. He actually does stuff for the Sublation Twitch channel for Socialist Legacy. And I think Reed Kane, yes. Try not to use his real name because I actually know it. So I think his work is some of the most erudite Marx scholarship that that's coming out of young people that isn't from an established Marx scholar like, say, Fred Mosley or Michael Heinrich or someone like that. And he's quite orthodox in his understanding of Marx. And he's written for you, had a debate with Mike McManus, who's also been on the show. And I think I don't always agree with Mike's contemporary politics on the left, but I think Mike's one of the best scholars. Matt McManus is one of the best scholars on the right that's working right now. I think he actually is one of the best leftist writers on what's going on in the right. And I think his book on postmodern conservatism is actually dead on. And I say this coming out of that, there's not many other people. I guess the people from Know Your Enemy, have that kind of background. But I would say they have some kind of mixture of progressive liberal plus some socialist stuff thrown in there in their line. What makes Sublation interesting, though, is Cosmonauts attached to a tendency. Strange Matters is attached to a tendency. The big magazines, Jacobin, The Nation now, they're all attached to a tendency. People can say that they're broad space clearinghouses, and they kind of are. You can find people who are not social democrats or democratic socialists or whatever they want to call themselves this week at Jacobin. But Jacobin has a line. Like, in fact, Jacobin pretty much is the DSA line, probably more than DSA's own internal magazine is. So that I find interesting about Sublation. I have found, however, in running a magazine with a similar mission, that it's really hard to do.
I think yes, it's probably hard to do, and I kind of hinted at some of the differences that might come up. You can kind of agree broadly, maybe on like 90% of the people who you would regard as being left, right? Mm-hmm. Being on the left. But there are always, everybody will have different groups and different tendencies and different people that they will see as being beyond the pale. And of course, everybody in that editorial team has a different notion of who is beyond the pale. And it might not come up all the time, but obviously it will come up at some point, right?
Well, that is actually for people who don't know, one of the tensions between Doug Lane and I is we actually have a different line on what's beyond the pale. And mine tends to be, do you take right-wing money?
Right.
That's my line, actually. And that doesn't mean I won't talk to someone, but I do not talk to them as an ally or a comrade.
Right.
And that's what it is. Now, do I love everyone who gets published in Sublation magazine? No. But nor should I. Like, that'd be weird. And one of the things that I will give a truly non-sectarian magazine credit for versus, say, a seemingly non-sectarian magazine is I actually can't deduce a line from what I see in Sublation. Like, there's enough responses and counter responses and this, that, and the other that I couldn't tell you, like, there's secretly some line being promoted there. Whereas a lot of times what you actually have in these non-sectarian magazines is even when they publish people who disagree with them, they're publishing things to actually forward a very specific but not stated agenda. And I think we see that a lot in the socialist press. And a lot of non-sectarian magazines, one of the most famous ones would be Monthly Review, is a non-sectarian left publication out of the United States, going all the way back to Paul Sweezy in the 70s. It even publishes MMTers, people who aren't Marxist. Yet I can tell you over time, it does more or less have a line now, or a couple of lines. There are things that it's not going to touch, and there are things in which it's going to promote a very sort of clear agenda that it did not used to have in the past, actually. So that's something that is hard to deal with because of exactly what you say. People have what really actually happens is people move their definition of what counts as viable and left within their non-sectarian view. And you do have to have a line. Like you can't, like there does have to be some people who are excluded.
Yeah, I think that's that's important. I think one of the problems that a project like this may not have now, but will probably happen if it continues for a long period of time, is obviously that just general atrophy towards a political line, the kind of gravitational pull of a group that has been publishing together for a long time and end up even unwittingly developing a kind of political line. I think one of this advantages Sublation has at the moment is it's new. And also there's like very big political differences between everybody on the editorial board. So, we're not trying to convince each other, but rather the objective is like, okay, let's find this position and let's find the most eloquent way that this position can be put forward. What do they call it? Steel manning, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whatever position. For example, if somebody came to us and was like, I want to steel man, I want to put the case forward for, Bernie 2024 or, doing Democratic Party entryism, although we published a piece by you critiquing that point, we'd be happy to publish somebody who would want to make the case for that and why that would be a good idea. But we'd want them to make the strongest possible case and, not do like a kind of bad job of it, right? For example, the first piece we published on Ukraine was a kind of supporting the left should militarily support Ukraine. And the reason we published that was like, well, that is like a position held by people who are not, on the left or nominally on the left, however you want to phrase it. Make the case as strongly as you can. And then we've published pieces that are, vigorously critical of that, because we want those ideas to be side by side. I think what you point to, Varn, is I think some inverted commas non-sectarian presses, what they might do is have a kind of straw man article from someone they disagree with in order to knock it down and make them look bad, right?
Right. Or they'll selectively pick someone who they disagree with, but agrees with them on one point. That's pushing a sectarian line, which I think is more of what usually happens at, say, Monthly Review, for example. There's a lot of people who do not share Monthly Review's kind of broad politics, but they agree on one issue. Say they have a problem with the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, which is a Sweezy thing,
right,
going all the way back to the foundation of the group. And there you go. You publish stuff around that, even if it doesn't agree with the rest of your politics. I think the other thing that's difficult, though, is there's the self-selection bias and people who will submit to you because there are lines. And that's another issue that I've had. So, for example, when I ran North Star, the ISO was still around, and we were declared enemies of the ISO because of a previous editor's article critical of its development before it fell apart, and the various scandals in which it fell apart. And they went after the entire magazine and also would not work with us. And since the ISO controlled a lot of the Marxist press in America, that was kind of a problem. They don't anymore because they don't exist, but that is the origins of Haymarket Books, for example.
Yeah, I mean, we've had some hostility from certain quarters of the established left, largely because of the association with the Platypus Affiliated Society, which is there's not an actual association beyond with the magazine or the running of the magazine beyond the fact that Spencer Leonard is a Platt. So, obviously the Platts are a controversial group, and some people were upset about that. Some people, were accusing everybody of being Plattopized or whatever that means. And it's like, look, I'm well known not to be a Platt. I don't have a strong emotional opinion about the Platts, but I'm certainly would not count myself as a Platt or a fellow traveler of the Platts. I don't think Ashley or Kuba or definitely not Pascal would see themselves in that way. So obviously, yeah, like because someone is associated with a particular group, that upsets some people because, the left is notoriously unforgiving to one another. But we've also had people who have been, quite supportive of the general Sublation project. I mean, I would say, even though some of the things that we publish in Sublation are critical of like the Jacobin DSA line, Ben Burgess, even Bhaskar Sikara have been like, favorable towards the project and, on a technical level have, offered advice and help. And, that's appreciated too, because, we're all the job, I think, at least in left media, is to try and learn and educate from one another. Not everybody's going to be, right 100% about, every single topic. And if we can't at least at the first step, have a kind of comradely relationship in a media sphere, which may be seeming to be vibrant and booming, but does not have any money in it. If we can't work together to discuss the ideas, we're going to have a moribund and stagnant left in this country. So I think it's important, that we work together and we try to be nice and talk to people. That doesn't mean though we have to like pull our punches with critique, but we should be making that critique about ideas, not about people. And on a personal level, we should be trying to help each other, I think. If that makes sense, if that distinction makes sense, but especially because we're not political organizations, right?
Right.
We're media operations, and I don't think, media operations necessarily need to be mowing each other over, over sectarian differences. I think we should help grow the sphere, try and get socialist ideas out there, and, try and learn, discuss, and, sublate, right? Let's try and find what the best ideas are and move forward with them and transcend the problems we have, because we are in a crisis, right? The period of good feelings that we had from 2015 until 2020, where everybody kind of put their differences on the back burner, that period's over, right? And it's not going to come back. So
yeah, I mean, the liquidation of the sectarian left into the democratic socialist left has not gone as expected, I would say. And I think that does have to be dealt with. And it has to be dealt with honestly. I had a very long conversation with David Griscom recently that will be out by the time this airs. And, we agree on everything till we started talking about Bernie to DSA, Salazar, and the DSA tactics. And I think David was a little surprised how deeply critical I was. And yet I also talked about like strategies that would be amenable to working with the DSA, which he was also surprised about, because he was like, well, most people who do this just kind of shit on us on Twitter. And I'm like, well, you can't have in the United States. I'm not sure that I believe a electoral path to socialism or even social democracy is possible, but I also don't think anything else is possible without that at least existing. So you do have to have some kind of electoral strategy, some kind of program, some kind of programmatic unity emerge. And you know, the era of good feelings was just that. There wasn't any underlying agreement on, say, what socialism even was, what Bernie's policies really should be,
or what even Bernie Sanders' run meant, what
right.
the objective was.
Right. There was no consistency of that, and that's not. And normally those things don't happen, but they do eventually have to happen. So like you have to come to a narrative. You have to come kind of some sense of programmatic self-explanation, or you are kind of sitting in the water. And I actually think about this in the difference in the way Republicans approach politics and the way Democrats in America approach politics is Republicans. The left often misunderstands the unity of the right. The right is unified on a few programmatic bases, and they operate that way. But if you've ever been actually on the right, it's a free-for-all all the fucking time. It's actually it's just as vicious, if not more so, than we are. But there is an understanding of programmatic unity, and when there's a fight about what the program's going to be on the right, such as Trumpists versus establishment Republicans, are the shift now with some kind of synthesis figure like DeSantis. To get to that synthesis figure, total war is politically raged. And that's not, the Democrats don't have a program, but they also don't have any way to wage total war. And unfortunately, you kind of see this in the way they approach, like the DSA approaches the Dems with a strong critique, but also trying to defend them at the same time, and actually often getting in total knots. You need to have a vibrant and combative left for such a program to emerge. And I don't think people get that. I think they kind of want the cart before the horse, because we came in this era of good feelings. You know, we were moving the Overton windows to socialism was an acceptable word in America, blah, 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 blah. Right. And you can kind of hear that I have slight contempt for that, because I don't think what that actually did was make any substantive form of socialism more popular. I think it rebranded progressive politics.
I think it's a little bit of both. And I think this is what we're seeing with this race in New York City, in which you have Nomiki Konst running against the DSA candidate Gonzalez. You're having a fight between a sort of Democratic Party New Deal progressive, and whatever you think of the DSA, whether you think they're real deal socialists or not, but someone who's come out of a movement that sees itself as being anchored in the socialist tradition at the very least. I know some people will disagree with that. Some people will disagree with me, hedging my bets on whether DSA is socialist or not. But the point I'm trying to make is you have someone who comes out of a movement that is explicitly socialist, and there is a notion that you have like a committee. You come up through the committee, and you become the candidate through a political party in a more European sense, rather than this weird kind of thing that Republicans, Democrats are, which isn't actually a party in the European or non-American sense of the word. And then you have someone like Nomiki Konst, who maybe programmatically is not that different from the DSA candidate, at least in what their terms of what they're putting forward or what they're emphasizing. But in terms of the style and strategy of politics is like fundamentally different. Someone who is raised inside the Democratic Party bureaucracy, NGO complex, and the media sphere, who comes to politics not as an avatar of a political movement, but as a professional who fights against institutions and whose CV is the selling point, right? And this is just a very different philosophy of where political leaders come from, where political, how politics should be conducted. And that difference between, let's just say, the kind of the left wing of the Democratic Party, who I think, would like to go to kind of New Deal politics, would like universal healthcare, would like a welfare state because, they think it's good for capitalism, right? And then people who regard themselves as in the anti-capitalist socialist tradition, that was obfuscated 5 years by the Sanders campaign. And those fissures are coming to the fore now. We're seeing a difference between the progressive wing of the Democratic Party and DSA and other socialist groups, which, they're discovering that their friends are not necessarily their friends, right? They're discovering that unity behind a Sanders candidacy is not the same as like a political unity of goal. Like their understanding of what socialism is not the same. And I think that is just one area where the end of the Sanders campaign and, the fact that it's unlikely, I think, that he will run in 2024, with that gone, that unity is split. And then, of course, I think on the other end, let's say on the left end, DSA is going to suffer as people become disillusioned with the strategy that DSA has been pursuing towards the Democratic Party and entryism into the Democratic Party. And I'll state quite clearly, I don't have a problem with trying to run electoral politics on a Democratic Party ballot line for a variety of different institutional reasons in the way that the American electoral system is set up. I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem if a socialist wants to try and chance it in a Republican primary. If you're like running in Christian County, Missouri, like why would you bother running as a Democrat, right?
You should either run as an independent
or as a Republican. It doesn't matter. I think there are some people who are like very emotionally invested in like, oh, Democrats. But the point is, if you want to even extract concessions from the Democratic Party, it's not good enough. It's certainly not going to work if you're going to, at the end of the day, after the primary, rally behind the Democratic Party candidate. It's not even good enough, as DSA in several cases, like to declare a kind of neutrality that, we're not going to be involved because we're not going to endorse, right? No, you actually have to actively sabotage, and you have to make it painful for the Democratic Party. And of course, what will happen is that well-meaning liberals, for quite a humanitarian reason, will be like, look, you're going to do that, but when the Republicans come to power, they're going to hurt people, or they're going to like do things that will make things materially worse for people. Not that the Democrats make things better.
But that argument used to have some sway with me after years of arguing for abstentionism. It no longer does, because on almost every key vector, things have actually gotten worse under Democratic rule, and including the law.
Yeah, that's generally a position I'm moving towards too, because it's like, yes, okay, if you could demonstrate that at the very least the Democrats might arrest some material suffering, or they might do something effective to protect democracy, then that I'd see the case, right? But the Democratic Party is so incoherent and is so unable to, actualize on even its own disingenuous rhetoric. It can't even do things in its own terms, right?
Right. It can't, and it's not particularly interested in it. This is the thing. Like, let's like be completely honest about what the Democratic Party strategy has historically been. which is to try to pass things when they're in opposition that they know will not get through. And then when they're in power, to not do any of that, because it immediately shows the fractures within the party itself and its donor base.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond even that, one of the things I've been pointing out to people is this is the most ideologically coherent Democratic Party we've ever had. All right? That's what should scare the fuck out of people. Now, during the height of the progressive movement from FDR to LBJ, right, as far as like they're actually getting shit done, you have to remember they were still in coalition with goddamn Dixiecrats.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, they had like some communists who were doing Popular Front with them, blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, that was an even more ideologically fraught Democratic Party. However, the leaders of that Democratic Party did play hardball. That has been systemically erased since the Atari Democrats in 1984. Like, so it's an issue that I have, and I also don't have a problem if you're in New York, you got to run on a Democratic ballot line to feasibly have a chance. You do it, but what you would need is an independent socialist movement that was able to cobble together a program to which you were at least implicitly held accountable to by that movement. Now, that movement does not have to be a party. In America, at least until there's significant electoral reforms, probably can't be a party.
Mm-hmm.
And so how do you build it? But the era of good feelings for me has also been the era of deliberate self-delusion. And that is over, but the response has been kind of incoherent shock, because it's not just, I mean, we're shitting about the DSA, but a lot of the responses to this and the radicalizations, I mean, when you go on Twitter and you hear Americans talking about socialism with orthodox characteristics so that they can team up with Russia, you have known that people have just lost their mind.
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, people like picking on the DSA, you know, is like easy picking
because they're the biggest. They're
the biggest ones, and
right.
you know, it's like people can complain about Jacobin, and people can complain about DSA, and I'm not saying they shouldn't be critiqued or anything, but it's like also you guys failed as well, right? Don't pretend that you didn't have your Bernie pens in, and we're like, oh yeah, like Bernie's going to usher in Medicare for all. Like most people. Now, like I said, people did it for different reasons. The sectarian left, most of them liquidated themselves into the Sanders campaign. You know.
Yeah, I mean, you can talk about the rise and fall of the militant tendency of the Trotskyists, aka the socialist alternative tendency. It's basically been Kasama to Watt to Bernie, and then liquidate into the DSA, and then the remainder of the socialist alternative basically rallies around to keep Kasama Sawat on the city council of Seattle. And like its entire sectarian resources is now devoted just to that. And I don't know.
I mean like to return to the issue with the Republicans, I mean, obviously there are like serious things to consider about, you know, sinking Democrats, right? It's like, it's not like a cost-free strategy. It's like, oh, why don't you just do it? It's like, I think it's necessary, right? If you want to pressure the Democratic Party, if you want to be able to exercise influence, you have to like hit him in the balls, right?
Which is why Joe Manchin is basically the king of the goddamn country right
exactly.
now.
You know, if socialists were powerful enough to swing like 3 or 4 senatorial elections, in, you know, swing states, you know, we'd probably be a lot closer to Medicare for all, right? But obviously, if in the general you just rally behind the Democrats, they know they don't need to actually do anything. They need to crush you in the primaries, and then, you know, in the generals, most people will rally behind them. But you know, the flip side of that is that when the Republicans come in power with this Republican Party, there are like very disturbing tendencies for them to, entrench the, fill the judiciary with extremely reactionary people who will use the most unaccountable and undemocratic wing of the American state to sort of cement their economic and political interests.
Right.
Who
but the problem is that the Democrats have let them do it.
Yes, that's the counter argument. It's like, well, 8 years of Obama opened up the way for Donald Trump. I mean, there is the problem. The alternative is obviously there is a risk of going into a kind of accelerationist argument, which I think is equally problematic because look, we can't do counterfactuals in history. You can make two arguments about the Obama era, right? You can say the Obama era primed us for Trump, which is true. But you could also say that a whole bunch of new social movements bubbled up
which is also true.
Which is also true.
Although they were broad-based in opposition to Obama at first, and then reconciled with them and were recuperated fairly quickly. So it's hard to say that Occupy was like an anti-Republican movement.
But we need a combative left, and if we do if there is an electoral strategy, at least to extract some kind of meaningful concessions to improve the conditions of people, you have to play hardball, and playing hardball has risks, right?
Right.
Has big risks. It's not a guaranteed strategy. It's not like an easy way, but there isn't another easy way. Rolling into the Democratic Party or taking your ball home and sulking about it, like neither of those are viable political options. Now, the one of the big criticisms I would say is like, we're just not ready to do national politics.
No, we haven't built the infrastructure and that's when people heard my critique of like both building a party right now or entering the Democratic Party, it was that it was premature. It was not that I was inherently, like against the concept of a party. Although I also have to put the caveat, by what Marx and Engels or the historical socialist movement meant by a party has not been what a party has been in either the UK or the US in like ever, honestly. That tradition is a continental European tradition, and it has a different set of parameters, of which the historical SPD clearly belongs, of which pre-parliamentary Labour in the UK does kind of belong, but of which movements later don't, including those two parties, right? Like I would say the modern SPD doesn't really have that much to do with its historical origins, because European politics has increasingly looked a lot more like British and American politics over time. And the other thing I would say is like the forces of reaction are not just here, so they're not just coming out of organic political choices in the United States. And in fact, they came to the US rather late. Like this whole reactionary national populism has been popping up all over the world since 2007. Like, interestingly, during the Obama period, because America was kind of on a different cycle when what tripped it off, we didn't get that. In fact, Obama kind of was our first round of populism, like the way he ran his first campaign. I mean, it's so easy to forget this now because we don't remember the whole "yes, we can" thing and all this other stuff of that movement, and that he was running as an anti-systemic candidate against Hillary Clinton, which is also wild when you think about it. I mean,
Obama really is the proto-Trump, right?
In many ways, yes.
It was a charisma, it was a message and a style, but the meal you got at the end of the day was just like more Bill Clinton policies, And the same's kind of true from Trump. What did you get? Like tax cuts and aggressive.
With the exception of tariffs, almost the same thing you would get from any Republican president.
Yeah, I mean, tariffs was the outlier. And even with the foreign policy, I still have people on the left going, well, at least I was like, no, Trump was like a freaking bull in the china shop, nearly got into war with Iran, like greatly destabilized the Middle East through his posturing as well. So you got the same neocon nonsense as well, right? But now we're in this funny place, and we have to work out where to go. I'm not going to pretend that I know where to go, because like I don't have any answers. I don't even have know where to even begin. But there are a couple of things which I think could be hopeful. For example, the DSA, for all its faults, is kind of a clearinghouse for socialists. It's a place to go for socialists. It's like a meeting place for people. Something like the DSA could form the nucleus of what I think is required in America. And maybe I'm wrong because you know more about America than I do, Ron, but building, because, breaking into politics with a political party doesn't really work in America, because the Republicans and the Democratic Party are more like sort of administrative arms of the state than political parties. It could be the basis of a civil society movement that could start doing more things. Mutual aid is one thing people talk about, but start trying to build up some kind of civil society socialism that could later on form the nucleus of a more overtly political movement that could challenge in elections. But I think to do that, it would have to become a more disciplined organization with a clear program, and not like a socialist club. It has to go to that next level of you can't have all these tendencies, right? You have to rally behind like a more concrete political program, and have some kind of party discipline. Because how do you discipline, and even if you elect people, how do you discipline them until you're a force to be reckoned with? DSA can have someone elected, as they have done in the past, and then that person gets into Congress and turn around and can say, well, fuck you, buddy, I'm not going to do that because, you're not critical to my re-election anymore. You have no power to control
Which is exactly what has happened with the squad, in so much they were ever endorsed by the DSA.
Well, I think one of the things is I think there's a big misconception, for example, about AOC, or at least from my knowledge. It's like DSA did help in the campaign, but AOC, it's
a Ted Kennedy staffer.
But, and also, I mean, Zach Exley was like linked to her recruitment, and he wasn't a DSA guy. He's a former Richard Wolff student who, worked as a Democratic Party fundraiser, right? But who was like a kind of left wing of the Democratic Party.
Right.
So,
but I mean, that's the problem that you have is, even let's assume that that wasn't even the fact with AOC, right? The moment she comes in the power, who's going to discipline her?
Exactly.
Who is she more afraid of, Pelosi or us? And clearly, frankly, she's not afraid of us. In fact, she's going to be the one trying to discipline us for Pelosi.
Mm-hmm.
That's exactly what she's going to do, because we did not. And I'm going to say something that's probably going to piss a lot of people off. She's not wrong to do that, given the incentives of her getting anything done. So you did not build a movement to contain these electors and these representatives at all before you unleashed them and then attached your brand to them. It was total opportunistic entryism. And the problem with that is not just that it's opportunistic or that it's entryism, is that it has no means of holding those people accountable, but now they're associated with your brand and your name. Frankly, this has been a problem not just in the United States. I mean, this is a problem of socialists who thought they were going to be able to have more influence in labor through Corbyn, but they were totally attached to Corbyn. Now, it is different, and that I think Corbyn had more loyalties. But Corbyn's position, if we're really honest, like, he didn't just fail because of the right wing of Labour. He also failed because he had no coherent answer to Brexit and couldn't keep his coalition together.
And another thing, he couldn't discipline his party. I mean, in Britain, once you're, you could have democratized the selection of MPs, which would have basically served to eradicate the Labour right within the party. In Britain, we don't have primaries. Once you become an MP, the process of not being allowed to run again as that MP is the extraordinary process of deselection, right? By having competitive primaries for every election within the Labour Party, which could have been done, all these jackasses who were sabotaging Corbyn, they would have been booted out by the party membership, right? Or at least a big they would have been absolutely crippled. But did Corbyn do that? No. Corbyn tried to compromise with the political right because he thought that he could bring to the game. It's the analogy is like people who think that Daddy Xi's gonna come and save them. It's like Daddy Xi, probably what the Chinese bureaucracy wants the most is not to like fight American imperialism. It's just compromise with them, right?
Well, China is a crucial node in the capitalist system, whether you think it's capitalist or not.
Yeah,
and that's what I keep pointing to people. And it's having its own problems right now in housing and banking. And the idea, even put by non-Marxists, frankly, there's a lot of MMTers who've gone in this boat too, that just because that China's being forced into being a reserve currency before it wants to be. All right, that needs to be stated. It did not move to become a reserve currency this fast. It's pretty clear to me that there was a long-term developmentalist road, a detente with the left, a building up of a physical land infrastructure based on the Belt and Road Initiative, and all this that China wanted to do that's been scuttled now between COVID and the Ukraine-Russia war, that they can no longer do at this moment. But now they're being forced into being a reserve currency because the US dollar is too strong and everything else is unstable. It's not like people are going to rush the goddamn pound or the euro right now.
And so the analogy with Corbyn is, at the end of the day, Corbyn's a member of the Labour Party and is loyal to the Labour Party, right? And, will only push so far to disturb the system, just as China will only push so far to disturb the system. I guess it's a bit of a stretch of an analogy. But
China does. I mean, like, let's assume everything Xi says is sincere, and he really wants to bring about world socialism in a long game. Although he's never actually said he wanted world socialism, to be honest. They are not at a state where they could do that by their own admission. So to expect, and there's increasingly a high number of people who seem to have this messianic faith, in the same way people have messianic faith in Bernie in some of the worst cases scenario, Biden, to bring about a New Deal. I mean, I heard some former Trotskyists that I respect, such as Andrew Hartman, who I do sincerely respect, think that the situation of political economy had made Biden some kind of neo-Fordist. And no one has called anyone to account for this. All right. So in this sense, I agree with you. The era of good feelings is over because we have to come to to some accountability for our mistakes. And my response to the Bernie campaign, you didn't know me back then, was silence. Because I was actually just, I was like, you know what, fine. If Bernie wins, maybe something will happen. It will at least expose a whole lot of the problems in the system because Bernie's going to be unable to get shit done with his current Congress. But whatever, But in a way, that was just me trying to rationalize the situation that I didn't see coming.
Well, it is remarkable that the cost of winning a proportional chunk of the left, inverted commas. I'm not saying everybody, a proportion of, let's say, soft Bernie Sanders to absolute loyalty to the Democratic Party is so low, right? But the Democratic Party is so weak and atrophied, it cannot do even, good old fashioned, dirty, power consolidation politics, right?
Right. They're not willing to, for example, sacrifice West Virginia to have a chance to actually win, the election. They're going to lose anyway, so why not? But they're not going to do that.
They could do something.
Like if
they could do something right now, like, get rid of everybody's student debts, right? It's legal. Biden could do it at the stroke of a pen, and he could keep doing it every year until Congress said it was going to be fixed, right? And then he would, people might be disappointed with everybody else, but a huge proportion of people who are struggling under some college debt would be consolidated into his presidency. Who would have a concrete material interest in his presidency, right?
But instead, he did the worst thing you could do, which was to hint that he was going to do it and did nothing at all.
The same with healthcare. What happened to this public option? Forget about this. I would go I can't vote in America, but I would go out and vote for fucking Joe Biden. If there was, if there was nothing else on the table, I'd vote for him if I got that fucking 300.
Even a public option.
No, for the 300 quid for the kids, right? Yeah,
but we can't because of inflation, even though that's not what's driving inflation.
They don't do fucking nothing. And then you have all these people, all these upper class liberals who I know, and these Democratic hack people who fucking start chiding you about being so privileged that you don't want to support the Democrats. It's like these people are their privilege is why they support the Democrats, because they're isolated from what's happening. Exactly.
And let's be honest. The Democrats are more of a party of graduate degree holders than they've ever been. Mm-hmm. And the graduate degree holders are from a more elite background than they have historically been to, which is the irony of this whole period, Gene. In fact, the period of good feeling, when we were all going to fight inequity, has been the period of the most increased inequity since fucking Reagan. I'm not mad at you, but the whole thought of how we have been talking about this and blowing hot air about it and achieved less than nothing in a decade is, another example. I'm hearing, Biden's trying to take credit for the revitalization of private sector unionism, except that it's not revitalized. Yes, we are seeing union movements in Starbucks and in Amazon, although Biden's actually doing things to crush public sector unions and other things. He's used executive orders to fuck over railway workers already. And to make that largely impossible for them to strike, but whatever. That's a whole nother thing that people aren't paying attention to. But that has come out at a low point of labor, because all the gains that were made in the past 7 years up to 2020 were lost between 2020 and 2021. So we're actually starting at a lower point than we've ever been in private sector unionization after COVID.
And God knows what's going to happen as they raise interest rates, which is basically making people unemployed. I mean, that's what the policy is, right?
Yeah, it's actually what Michael Roberts has been pointing out. It's actually not working to make people unemployed, which was what I have been. I mean, it's unemploying people in the tech sector, which was full of of investment that felt safe because of QE policies that no longer exist. But the bigger issue is, well, when you have a shrinking population and no real immigration, how bad do you have to hurt the economy to shrink it down to have a slightly higher level of unemployment? And it's actually quite a bit And particularly since it's not driving most of the inflation. It's driving some of it, but you'd have to really hit to really bring inflation back down to even 6-7%.
And yeah, so I mean, it's a dire situation, and the left, and I you know, like I said, I'm ecumenical about who's on the left, is in a complete disarray about what the strategy going forwards is. And you know, it's I kind of want to be sympathetic here. It's kind of understandable because there doesn't look to be very good options. Like people wanting to LARP that we're about to fight a fucking People's Peasants War against the American state, or that like
they think there's going to be some kind of civil war between us and the reactionaries, and the largest military in the world is just going to let it happen.
Yeah, or people who are fantasizing about like this militant uprising of workers. They're also on, like kind of detached from reality as well. People who think that like some foreign power is going to come in and emancipate the American proletariat, that too seems distant. To give DSA,
no one's even emancipating the Sri Lankan proletariat. So come on.
To balance out the critiques that we've been doing of DSA, at least DSA is trying a strategy, right? They're trying to think through a strategy of like what
most of the rest of this is eschatology. Like, let's be honest.
Yeah, the most of the rest of it is just utter confusion, and you get and you end up with like people like utterly ridiculous kinds of politics. Fetishizing third worldism, or you get the opposite where people become like Afro pessimists, or all get attracted to all kinds of weird political tendencies that are a result of a disillusionment with the strategy that DSA and the sort of mainstream of the left is trying. But at least they're trying.
I mean, what we can compare this to the failure of the McGovern campaign and the beginnings of things like LaRoucheism. We've seen this before, and honestly, we've seen this before in the birth of Italian fascism in specific. And I'm not saying that all these groups are fascist. That's not what I'm actually implying. But there's always a tendency of people who get sick of one kind of tailing and then go in the opposite direction. Often, they actually come out of ultra-leftist tendencies. Mussolini was probably close to a leftcom faction. He took an accelerationist position, an explicitly accelerationist position towards World War I, and to destroy the Italian state, was traumatized in World War I, and then started believing that he should defend the Italian state. And, I mean, this is in his own writing. This is not even me projecting upon history. This is what he said. So you can see this in the past, right? It's not the same as now. And I think people sometimes also, I think in all left tendencies sometimes tend to project the past upon the present as if it's going to be one-to-one, but it rhymes. Mm-hmm. And there's a reason why these things happen. And there's a reason specifically why they happen when something like a popular front fails. And let's be honest, the era of good feeling was an unconscious and unprogrammatic popular front. So it's like the worst form of popular front because it's a popular front that doesn't even know what it's fighting.
The irony is all these anti-DSA, anti-popular front people nowadays style themselves as Stalinists. It's like
the inventors of the popular front. I know
it's like what you want to liquidate into the Democratic Party too. I mean, like that's what happened. I mean, I think when we look at the popular front as a strategy, while it is understandable, it hasn't been that successful, I guess, for communists and leftists.
It's pretty much never been successful. I mean, just did lead to the ultra left, like position that I don't actually agree with, but there was an ultra left position held in the 70s up through, like some ultra leftists still held it, and I should say left communists. I shouldn't use ultra leftist because that's an insult, but that anti-fascism was the second worst product of fascism. You know, because it created a liberal popular front, which actually integrated, which consolidated liberal power, and in a key sense, I don't agree with that because I do think like just letting fascists rule would have been a goddamn.
I mean, you see the opposite. I mean, you know,
third periodism put fascism in power. Let's kind of be honest.
Yeah, exactly. Although, like, you know, people like to dog on the Communist Party of Germany, for example, for letting the fascists in, but it's like, yeah, but who were the ones who unleashed the Freikorps on the communists?
Yeah, no, you both sides of that dialectic did unforgivable things.
Yeah. So the the other this is why it's a difficult strategic position, because you're trying to predict the future. Maybe there are times when a popular front is required to stave off like literal like execution.
But there are other ways to organize that are left unity was not always based on a popular front model. I mean, this is the thing about non-sectarianism, like the united front from above and below, which I explicitly mentioned because there was a united front from above period and a united front from below period, and third periodism was the adoption of the united front from below. You would unite with workers, so even if they weren't communist, but you wouldn't deal with the leadership of any political movement. The united front from above is the classical second international strategy, where you are willing to make strategic policy deals with to stop certain things from happening, but you won't join in government, which you can't do in the US anyway, so some of this strategy doesn't even apply. But you don't join in government with them, you don't join their party, and you don't endorse them. What we kind of have now is popular frontism in practice, and then but like united front from above in theory, where we're not technically endorsing anyone, but we're practically endorsing them and canvassing for them and giving them money and labor. The issue that you have, I think, is that unless you are a huge movement, you are actually subjugating yourself to the larger bourgeois movement. Now, and
we see this with the left, not simply in political terms, but in ideological terms, with the infiltration of all kinds of reactionary liberal politics into left discourse.
Right. I would say from ID poll to patriotic socialism are all actually forms of this.
Yeah, exactly. Patriotic socialism, which is like fetishizing, you know, you have the patriotic socialism, which is kind of, I guess, a rebranded third worldism, you know, kind of soup of like ideology. It's
third worldism, but with Lincoln somehow. Like
inverted American exceptionalism, but it's a very weird ideological stew. Then you have all these academic trends.
There's plenty of Marxists who are trying to reconcile with Afro-pessimism, for example.
Yeah, or we actually have a piece coming up soon in Sublation magazine, which discusses the relationship between critical race theory and Marxism, and makes by the time this comes out, this article will probably be out, but makes the point that Afro-pessimism, critical race theory, for example, promotes a kind of Afro-pessimistic worldview, which on one hand sees racism as like an eternal feature of American society, but also sees America and the American state as an eternal institution as well. So it's a kind of weird kind of patriotism, where Marxism is actually an optimistic ideology that these problems can be overcome. And I was talking to Pascal about this, and I think he said it before, but if you want to look at where Afro-pessimism takes you, look at Clarence Thomas. Like, you don't trust the white man's honky state. They're going to try and soy Wojak all your men folk. and so you have to like limit the state as much as possible, and so that's where you get, you know, like Clarence Thomas's.
Yeah, Corey Robbins is actually pretty good on this too.
Yeah, so this is like, I think this is a product of liberal hegemony, because I think a lot of this ideology, this, let's say, idpol on the kind of academic left and patriotic socialism, it all diverts the left in very, let's just say, problematic directions. Like when I read somewhere, I don't know if they ever implemented it, they wanted to have like a race-based voting system in one of the DSA chapters. It's like, what
there
happened?
there was a union in Canada that actually did have a race-based voting system where different racial groups had different weights in the votes in the union, which of course produced massive defections from a closed shop union in Canada. It's almost like a perfect liberal storm to do that.
It's like a psyop. It's like a psyop,
right? And there's also been, like, we had issues in our union at the ideological level with people trying to undo anti-discrimination language and undo anti-discrimination clauses and contracts, so that in Utah, all right, I want people to think about this, in Utah, so that they could do more race-based promotions. And I'm like, you don't even have the base to promote outside of Salt Lake City. I don't know what you're doing if you're going to do that here, except encouraging increased defections from the union, which, of course, it didn't go through because it's blatantly illegal under U.S. law.
Somebody told me at some of the organizing, I believe it was at Columbia University, there was a big fight over unionization, and then a whole lot of statements were made about white supremacy and trade unionism, and that the union should be shut down because it's racist from the get-go. This ideology these kind of race, ethnic-based ideology, as much as the practitioners will talk about the constructed nature of race and nationality and ethnicity, practically, in concrete political terms, they behave exactly the same as ethnic, essentialists, right? Is even though they will, you see it in some of the kind of HR liberalism, where you have, things like
strategic essentialism was always a problem on this sort of like post-colonial theory form of the left.
Yeah, well, don't get me started.
I mean, I know. I mean, but you have this idea. This is actually like a fundamental problem, and what I push back on people is when they want to exempt Marxism from this, because frankly, we built a lot of the legwork that liberals were able to convergently adapt to their own politics. And one of my perfect example is we created standpoint epistemology. Now, it doesn't flow from Marx, but it absolutely flowed from Lukács. History and class consciousness is based on, makes a standpoint epistemological argument. And the feminist of the 70s who created standpoint epistemology thought they were fighting postmodernism, which is ironic, and they considered themselves Marxists, and they were pulling from Lukács, but increasing the different standpoints from which you could include. And by doing that, they were also essentializing the standpoint, right? Which has been my argument about Lukács too. All right. So we cannot exempt ourselves from creating this. It's not just that liberal ideas have corrupted us, but it is also that we have contributed to these liberal ideas by convergent development. And that's a harder thing to look at and look straight at and look in the face. All right. I always used to tell people, yeah, we can bitch about postmodernists and post-Marxists as much as we want. Right. But post-Marxists, most of them started off as Marxists, and they didn't just betray because they were bad faith Marxists who were wanting to take down the whole system. They betrayed, I mean, specifically in France, where most of them originally came from, because the Communist Party of France's weird allegiance with the Mitterrand government looked worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And then also the Communist Party in France actually seemed like a conservative social democratic party in the 60s. All right, which was why there was all this Maoist stuff in response to that as well. So we created a lot of the things that are now being used against us ourselves. They are not just external to us, which is why the debates within our own, to tie it back to the Sublation, but all this stuff is so important. That's why I do all this stuff on the history, is because there are ways in which we make the weapons that are used against us a whole lot of the time.
Well, it's like the coffee shop. The coffee shop was invented in the Ottoman Empire, in the early Ottoman period, exported to Europe, and then in the 19th century was re-imported to the Ottoman Empire in a European form. And that's what's happened here, is a lot of these radical ideas from the 1960s were incorporated by liberalism, shorn of their materialist basis, repackaged in a like neoliberal form, and then sold back to people, right? So I think a lot of it is actually you're getting radical ideas from the 60s coming to the left, but not directly necessarily from the source in the 60s, but filtered through 40, 50 years of neoliberalism.
Oh yeah, I mean, white privilege is a perfect example of that. Like The Wages of Whiteness and White Skin Privilege by Ignatieff come out of organizing by communists trying to deal with the social tensions between black and white workers. And ironically, they were aimed to do the opposite of what this does now. So talking about white privilege was not aimed to alienate white workers. It was to get white workers to realize that their social privileges were granted to them by people who were oppressing them. And thus, in giving it up, they were actually strengthening their objective position. But we created the intellectual resources that were later tied into these liberal forms of a kind of have your cake and eat it too.
Well, it's become an alternative form of bourgeois morality, right? As the old Christian morality breaks down, there is a new form of
white people talking about how they don't want to see white people and everything in a country that
is full of white people.
That is full of white people. I do like to remind people that when we talk about the ascension of people of color, you know who we're actually talking about, right? We're talking about Latinos. We're talking about our Latin people. I'll use the gender neutral term. And the reason, and that's crucial to point out, because that's the group that is defecting from progressive politics the fastest. All right. And then when you see the representation of BIPOC in the media, the people who obviously overrepresent it tend to be, frankly, Southeast Asian and Asian, which are
high caste Hindus getting in on the Oppression Olympics in America to get tenure. I mean, it's absolutely freaking bonkers.
And then you have this disconnect between the elites that come in. I mean, how much of the diversity quota of Ivy League universities is met by immigrants? Very rich immigrants from Nigeria.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's how they do it, right? That's how these. It's a total facade, And I mean, I think like the perfect cultural expression of this liberal identity politics is Bridgerton. If you know about Bridgerton,
Oh
it's like,
God, yeah, my partner made me watch it, and I about threw up and told her I would never watch it again.
but it's like it's such a good, like, I think it's such a good example. That and Hamilton are such good examples of like the liberal worldview, where you just whitewash the brutal class system by making everything more diverse. I mean, like Bridgerton, it's like, oh, we're going to do like a period piece drama in which we'll have like all ethnically diverse people, which completely, you know, romanticizes the brutal class system upon which that society was constructed, but just color washes it. And so it's kind of sanitizes, like, well, it's okay because it's diverse, right? Or you have Hamilton, which is so egregiously offensive.
Yeah, every time I fucking hear that,
It's I said to someone, I was like, it's like having
that was on
like,
the list of my grievances with my ex-wife.
It's Hamilton.
I'm joking, actually, but still.
I believe that could be one. It's like doing a musical about the Iranian Revolution, but you have Khomeini played by a Baluchi lesbian, right?
Yeah.
You know, that's how like if you just put it that way, it's like that's how utterly absurd and ridiculous those things are.
Well, I mean, Hamilton is wild in a lot of ways because it's also trying to, I mean, I think it's trying to color wash one of the worst figures of the American Revolution, like one of the objectively worst figures of the American Revolution, whose response to, say, the Whiskey Rebellion was to shoot everyone. And even someone like George Washington had to stop him. I mean, it's wild that it recast this national developmentalist figure, not even in bourgeois terms, but in absolutely as if he was a modern liberal, and it's completely false, right?
It's like liberal rewriting of history. I mean,
but that is what, you know, I should have been more afraid, actually, when that became the dominant mode of discourse, because what happened after BLM is we have one of the most anti-systemic movements that we've seen in years come out, all right, and get recuperated not once but twice. Once during the end of the Obama administration, and then again during the end of the Trump administration. And while it has led to a diversification of media, that is to actually get people to be more devoted to flagging and failing capitalist enterprises, so that they will pay more rents because it so supposedly reflects their values. And unfortunately, the critique of that has been stolen from us by some of the most reactionary elements in our society.
Yeah, I mean, that's the problem that we have, is that, you know, people get upset. People start to, you know, people rightly are disturbed by this tendency and the abuse of identity in order to bolster, you know, a very unjust system.
Mm-hmm.
And their response is basically to invert everything. They don't critique it. They just invert the values and, you know, get triggered when they see like a woman in Star Trek, right? I mean, Star Trek's a good example. It's like,
yeah, Star Trek has always been kind of, I mean, not Gene Roddenberry's gender politics weren't great, but Star Trek has always been woke.
Yeah. But the interesting thing was, like, a lot of the people were going, Star Trek Discovery is bad, right? And it's like an objectively bad TV show, right? I feel sorry for the actors. I feel sorry for the special effects. It's just badly written, right?
Yeah, I was about to say that's all on the writers mostly. It's even decently directed. It's just poorly written.
Poorly written. And then people defending it were saying, "Oh, if you don't like Discovery, you're a sexist and a racist." Right?
You know what's funny is I realized this was like this deliberately tripping these fandoms, like culture wars became a marketing strategy in the mid-alt teens. Like, for example, people would like to say that the first attempt at a Ghostbusters reboot, with all the women, was all due to sexist. But the problem is the movie was bad, and it became hard to critique the movie because of reactionary critiques being leveled at it. But it was bad. Similarly, this has been a problem with Star Wars. I think there's a lot of reactionary Star Wars fandom, but there's also the fact that Star Wars, the shows, I will say that the shows have actually...
The shows are fine. They're fine.
Yeah, they're fine.
They're passable. They're fine. They go from good to fine. But the 3 movies were terrible. But it became a top-down cultural defense that critiques of certain cultural flagships in those critiques were almost used as a sorting mechanism and a marketing mechanism, as you say, because if you don't like Star Trek, you're a sexist. You better fucking go and watch it. Now, I'll tell you, like, you freaking watch Strange New Worlds. I don't know if you've seen Strange New Worlds.
I don't have Paramount Plus, but I am thinking about getting it because I've heard from many people it actually is interesting.
Yeah, it's got like lesbians, trans people, lots of different people of color. But you know what else? It's fucking good. It's a good TV show. It's great. It's fantastic. Totally awesome. Love it.
And I have not seen the reactionary backlash to it in the same way, honestly.
There probably is a reactionary backlash. There are probably people on the dark corner. There are probably people out there who, because they get so triggered.
But they're not getting blasted into the culture by the fact that we're all having to deal with a bad product. Right?
Exactly. Because we're not doing, exactly. Because it's not resonating with people because it's a good TV show. Now, it's definitely there is an attempt to bring, more people of color into, high-profile roles.
I mean, I would even say I don't have a problem with that. I think
that's fine. Good. Yeah, that's fine. It's like, why is it weird that most of the people on the bridge are women? Why is that weird? Usually it's all men. Now it's all women. What's the fucking future, dudes? Like, so what if it's all women, right? That's not the triggering point. But of course, there's like a reactionary critique, and it's very popular to all these cultural things, which feeds off, I think, a kind of deeper and kind of legitimate uncomfortableness about some of the implications of quote unquote identity politics. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think what's interesting though is the culture, interestingly enough, I think the culture has under democratic rule actually moved away from a lot of this. Interesting. And I think it's because it's become clear it's not materially benefiting that many people. It no longer feels weird to say that anymore. And I think that's where things have changed. I'm not saying it's gone away, but they're not trying to make statements against Trump as well. Right. But I don't think it'll work a second time either.
Well, I think that's the issue. I think the playbook is like, it worked under Obama like a treat, right? People wanted to be past all this stuff. People wanted to, prove their credentials, show that they weren't racist. But I think for a lot of black people, this was like the culmination of civil rights. It's like, this is it. I think all that kind of.
I think this has some unfortunate things about the trends of civil rights over the long term. But yes.
But the result, though, has been, I think people are deeply cynical. We live in an age of cynicism, and appealing, polarizing society around identity groups as opposed to class is probably not a great strategy, I would say.
Well, the other thing is, it's become clear that there's classes amongst identity groups that people don't want to deal with, and it's becoming clearer and clearer that is the case. I mean, and it ironically, it has been because of the material games of the civil rights movement and stuff like that we see this. So I don't want to sound like I'm, I'm not like, I actually think some of the stuff is the signs of development on these issues. It's positive, but it degrades over time. Like,
well, I mean, I've been saying this for a while, but like when you look at the dominant discourse, or at least like a very powerful strain of discourse that posits identity politics versus the new working class Republicans, right? That needs to be turned on its head, because the Republican working class discourse is not what you, as a Marxist, understand, or as a socialist, or even as a kind of class war liberal, what you understand by class. When those guys are talking about class, they're talking about a cultural group of people who work with their hands.
Mostly petit bourgeois are very specific niche workers that are actually only 13% of the population, as I point out all the time.
Exactly.
Like,
it's a culture, perhaps with a slight occupational tinge towards manual labor, but it's not a class definition. It's more of a cultural definition about the way you live your life. It's white, but it's not necessarily completely white. It could, there could be space for black person, but it is a cultural, a patriarchal blue collar worker who may be a proletarian or a petit bourgeois. He may be quite wealthy. He may own like a pool building company and make a lot of money, or like have got rich in plumbing or something like that. But it's a kind of cultural group of this.
Yeah, if you read Michael Lind, it makes it clear though what their actual objective is.
Yeah, Michael Lind doesn't hide it, right?
Right. I mean, he's like, we're propping up a counter elite to the professional class. And he's not even a PMC guy. Like he's actually much clearer about his definitions than we are.
So that is a cultural politics, right?
Right. And honestly, the left has bought into a lot of this cultural politics, even when they're right about things. I think Catherine Liu is right about a lot, but the way that we have framed PMC, like if you read Virtue Holders, it's an entirely almost cultural argument, and there's almost no political economy in that book.
Well, I mean, that's the second part of what I was going to say was that if we look at that then as like culturalism and identity politics dressed up as class politics, the identity politics is the reverse. It is a bourgeois politics for a section of people of color who have made it thanks to the abolition of white supremacy as a legal institution and the advances of civil rights. And those people want to protect their gains, and identity politics is a methodology in order to maintain their position as an intermediary group between the community and the state, their leadership roles, and also a way for them to make a case and provide an ideology about why they deserve a slice of a shrinking pie, right? Like academia is in decline, but also at the same time, well, how do you get a competitive advantage to get a job? Make the case that you need to have a more diverse academia. It becomes a kind of value, right?
Right. I'm going to say this as a person who studied the history of many of my peoples, one of which is the Jews. And this does not tend to work out for you in the long run, because when the actual bourgeoisie needs a scapegoat, you know who's it? You.
But that's what this identity politics is. It is a class politics, just as the so-called populist right is not a class politics.
No, it's an identity cultural politics masquerading as one.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people on the left, it surprises me, but more people than I would like seem to not understand that. I mean, one person who's really good on this, of course, is Pascal and Adolf Reed, and those people who have been sounding the alarm about.
But at the same time, Reed got conned by some people doing the workerish trick that we're talking about. Yeah, like let's be honest about that. He called it after the fact. He did, but he got conned by them.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a kind of when you've been stuck. It's like, well, Catherine Liu, I'm sympathetic to her because I can't imagine what it's like working in the frickin' University of California system.
Yeah,
That's
Irvine's probably slightly better than some other places, but yes, it's got to be awful. And I also think a lot of her points about liberal cultural norms are valid. Even it's not really a class explanation. Like there's not when you ask people to define what professional managerial class is, and then against a blue collar class, they're actually unclear whether or not they include service workers or not. Would they they'll take up productivist stuff, but then be very careful not to point out that excludes the service workers too.
Well, the problem the PMC argument has is that it's not necessarily meaningless to talk about a cultural division within a society. I mean, we know about ethnic divisions and racial divisions and religious divisions,
sectional divisions amongst the working class. And not all the people that would group the PMC are working class, which is another problem. Is by Marxist definitions, there are multiple class groups in that group.
It's a cultural definition, and it's and what someone like Lou is talking about. I would wager is that people go through the university,
right, and the university enculturates
them to a certain degree. When me and Kuba tend to talk about the PMCs, or what we're actually, I think the term is useful, but it really, if you want to talk about it in a kind of more functional sense, it's useful in talking about like the people who run the state and institutions, like not anyone with a university degree.
Adolf Reed defines it like Pascal told me Adolf Reed's definition. I'm like, well, that's coherent. It's people with a fiduciary responsibility defined by law. But again, I'm like, but that isn't the way people are using this, because that's like 1% of the population, not 40.
Yeah, I don't agree with that definition. I think that's like a very peculiar. That's a peculiar thing to fetishize. I think perhaps.
I think they're trying to come on with something that's coherent that defines it, because Ehrenreich really doesn't.
Yeah, I think. Ehrenreich. When I've read it. It's like it's a cultural argument, basically. It's about having.
Well, it was also at a time when having credentials actually enabled you to be management in a different way than it does now.
I think that's really important as well. I think it
was for a Fordist economy. It's not even for it's pre-neoliberal where that category comes from. It was only resurrected really after the Bernie campaign, and I think really for politically expedient reasons, if we're honest.
Well, I think
it wasn't Lou who resurrected it either. But when you read someone like Malcolm Swayuna or someone over at Compact Magazine, it becomes very clear that they're using it in a very pernicious way. And they don't really believe that the working class has an answer to this either. Their invocations of the working class are always cynical for more of a petite bourgeois counter, like.
Well, it's PMC. It's PMC on PMC violence. It's like what you have is a group of PMCs, by their own definition, telling you how bad all the other PMCs are. It's like, well, that's great, but like it's like a minority. It's like the rebel minority within the bureaucracy. But I think you raised an important point, Varn, which I think it's important to circle back on. Even up to the 70s, there was probably a pretty high correlation between having a university degree and being a member of the petty bourgeoisie or the bourgeoisie, right?
Yeah, or at least management that was paid in some form of stock, even if you drew a wage.
Yeah, exactly. Or labor aristocracy,
right?
If you're, I guess
labor aristocratic stuff too. And I do think labor aristocracy is a problem, and it does cover that category does cover a lot of people, and it's a little vague too. But the thing is, it doesn't conflate different categories of the petty bourgeoisie, and actually certain elements of the bourgeoisie, governmental managers who I don't know that I include anybody who formally works from government in the proletariat, which probably pisses a lot of people off.
Wait, what about the guys who fix the electric lines?
This was my argument against the PMC stuff, because I'm like, when you talk about carteling and credentialing and all that as part of that, then all these workers that work for state municipal governments that are semi-skilled but are curtailed and protected because they work for the state, they actually have privileges that regular workers do not have. So if the credentialed people with a college degree are a separate class, so are those workers. And that nobody wants to, like, I don't actually believe that, but if you actually buy into the logic of part of what makes you PMC is that you're labor aristocratic and you're protected from striking and whatnot and from competition, that's true for anyone who draws a government contract if they have a degree or not. Like, so.
But today, you know, the correlation between class and education is not so strong as it once was. And certainly the correlation between income and education is not super strong. I mean, like, I have an advanced degree. I'm probably not making like mega bucks, Varn. You know, like
a plumber's gonna make more than you.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not making mega bucks. So
there are people who are famous on a national level that I, as a teacher, make more than. Like, and I don't make a lot of money. Like,
yeah, so, you know. That's what I mean. Like, I tell every, you know, I advise for the graduate program here. One of the things I tell everybody is like, you know, that, you know, you're telling me you want to be a history professor. I'm telling you, you're probably better off becoming a high school teacher.
I would have said that till about 2 years ago, but it depends on where you're at, though.
Depends where you're at, and also at least there's jobs.
But no, that's for sure. You'll have a job. You just might. The problem is if it's a guaranteed job and we still hemorrhage 50% of the people who enter it, it tells you it's not a great job.
I mean, like, as much as people bitch about the university, if you get a job, like a full-time job and a secure job,
I don't know anyone who, like, well, I do know some people who quit it, but that's not super common.
It's a good job. I mean, it's a pleasant job to have. As much
even as a non-tenure track lecturer, it's not bad as long as you're full-time and have benefits.
Yeah,
it's only adjuncting that fucking sucks.
Well, that's the way it's going now, isn't it? I mean, that's proletarianization of the. I don't know if that's like, you know.
But it's funny because people will try to include them in the PMC class, and I'm like, okay, like, you're telling me that adjuncts are somehow oppressing you? Oh my god! Like,
well, it's because obviously a big basis of conservatism is about being aggrieved, right? I think Corey Pine writes about that. It's like you go back and it's all about like bitching about eggheads knowing too much and this, that, and the other. I think that's a key ideological appeal of conservatism. So yeah, I mean, so we have this big problem, Varn. We have this left that is being pulled in all different directions, from FDR fetishism to maybe we can make common cause with the Republicans, to
maybe you make common cause with Putin. Yeah,
well,
she's the one. Daddy G's the one. Daddy G is, to me, of the same weirdness as, I mean, it's equivalency of FDR worship. Daddy Putin is something else entirely. I'm going to not even take what this person is saying at face value when he starts a war blaming Lenin for the situation that's going on, and somehow try to pretend that because of my superior strategy and knowledge that I know even better than the Russians themselves, that they are on our side.
This is one of the issues I have with outlets like Gray Zone or Black Agenda Report and places like that. It's not that everything they say is wrong, and sometimes they're the only people out there saying the accurate news, right? You know,
that was even sometimes true for RT, as long as it wasn't about Russia.
Yeah, as long as the problem is that attached to this is a worldview which is fundamentally based in bourgeois moralism, because they
are not admitting that they're developmentalists. Those are the two.
Yeah, I mean,
that you could justify it.
I think one of the important things you have to keep in mind when you're on the left is okay, like the capitalists are your enemy or whatever, right? Fine. The media is dishonest, that's true. But sometimes the imperialist pigs are telling you the truth. And the question you have to ask yourself is not why are they lying, it's why are they telling you the truth, right? And I think a lot of like these sort of kind of third worldists, the different varieties of them, there's a kind of credulity where like they will be rightfully skeptical of the American state, but just like not skeptical of any other state around the world, if that makes sense. It's all, and it's all a symptom of our own failure, right? Because we've all failed to make a coherent movement, to make even the hope of a coherent and effective movement seem like a reality.
Right.
Because I don't think it's a reality. Like I could, people could say like, we're doing it. We're going to make socialism. And I'm like, I would like to believe that, but deep down, I kind of don't believe that. Like I'm not very optimistic. Not that it couldn't happen because it's beyond the realm of possibility.
But I don't think people have done the work or even come up with the vision to do the work for. Frankly.
It's like me saying like, I could tell you I can run a marathon, but I probably will have a heart attack while I'm trying to run a marathon. But that doesn't mean someday I couldn't run a marathon. I just haven't done the work I need to do to run a marathon. And I'm probably not going to be doing the work I need to do to run the marathon in the near future either.
Right. I think what compounds this is there is a socialist awareness of the urgency of some of the problems.
Mm-hmm.
And that for path dependent and systemic reasons that you're not going those problems are not going to slow down because you didn't build the stuff you needed to build. But there are times where I'm like, well, that just tells you how bad your fuck up in the past was, doesn't it? Like, you can't undo that. And that's where I become like, I think, everyone talks about Cuba as Mr. Black Pill. And people talk about me as Mr. Black Pill. I'm not that black pill, but on this I am. There are some things that once done at crucial junctures are not undoable. You have wasted the energy on that.
World War One.
Right. Exactly. And like probably no one in the whole system really wants the outcome, but they have no ability to undo the set of dominoes that have been set off. Now, there was probably points where those World War I could have been avoided. There you can find crucial junctures post facto that change the scenario, but who gives a shit? Like I mean, it's important as a thinking exercise to figure out what not to do in the future if confronted with similar conditions, right? Okay, it's true. But I think that's largely true with socialism. Like, the longer we take to get serious about what we need to do, the harder the thing to do will be. And we see this all over the West for sure. But I also think we see it in other parts of the world, and people just dig their hands into the ground about it.
Yeah, I mean, like all these people, for example, going nuts for like Vijay Prashad and stuff. It's like, well, he doesn't he back like the Indian Communist Party, which is like basically just Social Democrats in Kerala,
with some Brezhnev fetish. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, it's like none of these people are doing. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party, like, well, at least they got a lot of people out of poverty, but
right. But after dipping them in it in 1978, like,
I mean, we're in crazy times, Varn. We're in very crazy. I mean, I think this is one thing I'll give the Platts is that they. I mean, I think they're a little bit fetishy about the history stuff. I think it's like but you must know the struggle for socialism, and I think especially some of the younger members of that group, like the way their thinking goes is like, person X is making you vote Democrat, which might be true, and then I don't know, Eugene Debs, ate a chicken's head in 1921 for socialism. The left is dead, long live the left, and it kind of doesn't hang together. But I think where they are very correct is that we don't really know our history very well, right?
No.
And we don't, and I think the project of trying to understand the left history is an important one, and one we have to think about, if only to understand where we can go from the future. Yeah. Where I would probably disagree with them, and maybe I'm misunderstanding them, is I don't think you can just do that stage and then do the politics stage, right?
Right.
I think you have to do both things, I guess. I think that's
I think their politics tend to be hard for people to understand because they're always trying to basically troll the left into self-realization. And my point has always been with them, it doesn't work as a tactic. People don't realize shit just by basically trolling. Now, I don't think their pedagogical stuff is actually that. I think if you actually go through the pedagogical program, I have issues with it. It doesn't have enough economics in it, for one thing. Even Marxist economics. But and I have complained about their typologies of history being almost ideal types. And I say this, I was a Platt. Now, I've been told by Platts after I left that I didn't understand what the program was, but then I asked them if they can't tell me. So it's they're like, well, you do platypus by showing the left to itself. I'm like, well, how's that work for you? I did it too.
I mean, I'll give this. I think. I know Spencer Leonard is very sincere, and I know Chris Catrone is sincere, as much as people think he's just out there to, mess people around. I think that's a little bit of an unfair depiction of what he's
he has not helped himself in that regard.
But yeah, I think what basically in many ways it's kind of a presentational issue about how do you convince people to critique themselves and think about their feelings. This is a freaking hard thing to do. You know what I mean? It's people don't like facing criticism, even if it's good faith criticism. People will always look for the smallest kind of snidiness or ad hominem in order to dismiss the entire criticism.
Or they do, what they do a lot of what I do with the criticism. They think I'm talking about their enemies and don't look at themselves.
Mm-hmm.
That's the other thing. If you're not doing the platypus way, what I do, I often feel doesn't work either, because all these people that I'm directly attacking think I'm on their side. And it's
no, it's a hard thing. And I think having a vibrant, criticism, program of criticism is important. The problem with the old Stalinists was you could critique yourself all day long.
Critique anything else.
You can't critique, but you can't critique the program. When in fact, sometimes you need to critique the program. And I think, and this is not really a platypus critique I would have, but rather of these post-left people, is they just go down the full let's just do critique, and all that ends up being is kind of a one-upmanship and a way to go, haha, I'm so cool. And
a lot of it is let's pick some position that seems straightforward reactionary and figure out a way through usually arcane arguments that frankly usually aren't even entirely honest and involve misquoting Marx, get you to say that Marx really thinks like I do, he would have supported X, Y, or Z against X, Y, or Z, which to me is actually no different than what they're critiquing in the pop frontis / social democrats who just make Marx into basically liberalism. And you know, I know Catrone's the first guy who wrote Lenin's Liberalism, right? I mean, that's the article that really put him on the map before he wrote Why Not Trump. And one of the things about the Why Not Trump piece, if I hadn't seen the way certain younger plats acted during the Trump administration, particularly backing some of what I thought were the more problematic elements of the actual deviations of the Trump administration, just seemingly to own the libs, I also would have been like, well, it is highly unlikely that Trump at this stage will be able to do what you think he's going to do. And unfortunately, what I think happened, what I predicted would happen was like everyone's going to blow their wad pretending they're fighting fascism with Trump now, and actually laid the preconditions for a more authoritarian right to emerge.
And also lay the conditions. And I think we've talked about this before, Ron, is a convergence of authoritarianism between what liberals want and what conservatives want, which ends up in the same place, but for different reasons. Liberals shooting their wad about freaking January the 6th, about school shootings, about all kinds of
domestic terrorism bills, which actually will actually lead to like Patriot Act 4, but it won't be called that. It will be called
and so the liberals will. It's the kind of it's like what happened with Obama, right? Obama didn't reverse the national security state of Bush.
No,
he codified it. He entrenched it through putting it into a more regular bureaucratic mechanism.
Yep.
And
then he handed it over to Trump.
Yeah, and then he handed it over to Trump. One of the things that I have trouble with, which I think sometimes I think is fair, sometimes I think is not, is that I think people are a little unfair with the Why Not Trump article, but I think some things in that piece look a lot more accurate today than that they perhaps looked in 2016, because Trump is such a grotesque figure, and the Republican Party is, just like a caricaturishly grotesque political party. But now we're in like a situation where, like, we're going towards an authoritarian future. It's just like, what variety of right-wing authoritarianism do you want? Put it another way, if you want me to use a Turkey analogy, we've got the Kemalists, who are the Democrats,
and the Erdoganists, who are
the Republicans. And guess what? They're both going to fucking invade Cyprus, aren't they? So, they're driving in the same direction. One of the books that made me think about this is there was a book I read recently called, Why is Turkey Authoritarian? And, it's not like a completely novel argument, but it says, like, look, you come out, Turkey's always been ruled by the right. There's just been like a secular right and a religious right. And, that's the problem with the Republicans and the Democratic Party.
Right, except it's not clear. It's actually interesting to me because one of the things that I was listening to Europeans, which I probably should never do. No offense, Djene. I mean, you're a Kurd, so you have an out. But I was listening to Europeans talk about the rise of the evangelical right in America again, and I'm like, what rise? Like, they haven't risen shit. Like, they got traded a few horse stalls in Judgensrick, and they're getting louder and louder, but they're a declining social form and have been for 15 years, right? Like, in fact, they can't even produce their own intellectuals. All their intellectuals are Catholics. Like, I mean, true facts. Like, let's be honest here. Like,
and it's not just that. It's like where I am, yeah, like the conservative culture is hegemonic to a certain degree, no doubt. But I don't live where most Americans live, right? I don't live in like the main, like, liberal culture is like very dominant in this country. At least, like, it's the dominant paradigm.
Right. Although here's one thing I worry about. How much is that going to change as people have left the cities because they are leaving the cities?
It's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting to see how the culture shifts.
I mean, because the question becomes, do they change the rule? Like all these people who moved out from telecommuting who are now staying out because they can't even afford to go back. For a lot of people.
Right.
Like if you're in the lower middle tier of the quote PMC, you can't afford to go back to New York.
No.
So where are you going to go? Right? Like you can't, like, I remember this whole ad. God, this was so ridiculous. Newsom's ad about California versus Florida. And somebody was like, it's an economic ad. I'm like, well, actually both Florida and California are doing remarkably good in the current economy. And when the economy goes down, they tend to do remarkably bad, both states. The bigger issue that I saw is like, well, who is that appealing to? You're just trying to convince people who are going to already be convinced by you that you should be president, right? That you can stand up, but you're not doing shit. Like you're like, come to California and fight with us. And I'm like, one, if all the liberals in Florida, the few that are left, come to California, you've actually made the situation worse for yourself nationally, because California is like one of the most electorally irrelevant states.
Yeah.
So, but beyond that, even who is that for? Because a lot of people in Florida couldn't afford to come to California if they wanted to, and actually, a lot of Californians like to flout that at people. So it's like you know when you point out how like basically California's become almost like Guatemala City in the fact that you're either rich or you're homeless. Like,
it's truly becoming it's truly a society that is in degeneration, and like the liberals just don't have any answers for it. I mean, like I think of gun crime, Varn. It's like, okay, like gun control. I can kind of take it or leave it. It's like not really super important to me. I would kind of like to be in a place where there isn't that many guns, just personally speaking.
Yeah,
but like,
I'm a gun user, but I'm also like that. Yeah.
But America is like, it is what it is. It's like, also, do you want the state collecting all your guns up? I don't know. But like, also on the flip side, there's a lot of
Latin America has the same gun rules that Britain does, and they don't work.
And they don't. It's like, I don't know if that would be even feasible in America. Whatever. There could be things that could be done on a technical level to make things. But at the end of the day, my issue is that, like, look, this gun violence, obviously, like people who pretend that this is not the case, the guns act as, like an exacerbating factor, right?
Right.
The easy accessibility of guns.
Totally.
It makes it's like, look, if you want, like, my mother-in-law is always like, well, they stab people in England. It's like, yeah, but it takes like a lot of effort to go and stab someone. You can't just like freaking.
I mean, the Russians do manage to kill more of each other than the Americans do with stabbing, but they're pretty much it. And the Russians are dedicated.
Yeah. So
I'm being facetious, but it's actually a true stat that there's a higher murder rate per 100,000 in Russia than there is in the United States.
But that gets to my point, which is like Russia is in a society in total degeneration after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Not only like economic, but also like a deep moral and
Yeah. Dmitry Orlov's understanding collapse is actually like, here's how collapse works. This is what we saw after the fall of the Soviet Union. Have a nice day. Like
America is in this gun violence. The various different manifestations of it, whether it is school killings, whether it's Chicago gang violence, whether it's like, men killing themselves with guns.
Which is the most common thing that's going to happen to you with a gun, actually. The biggest thing that would be changed by handgun laws would be the reduction of suicide.
All those things, the gun makes it easy, but the problem is not the gun itself, but the social conditions which are giving rise to massive social violence in inner city America, a total disillusionment of of young people about the future, misery, like, you know, like like I often think it's like I would maybe would want to send my family back to England while I worked here, not because like England is so amazing, but like just in the schools, the level of bullying is lower, the level of, you know, the level of social alienation, the difficulty of, you know, for many like kids in this society. All these things are like deep-rooted social problems, which like have to have holistic approaches, whether those approaches are like a social democratic program or like full communism, right? But they need a material answer to them. And like gun legislation is like, it's just like, you know, it's like
It's a Band-Aid.
It's a Band-Aid that obfuscates what the real problem is. It's like a lot of the stuff to do with police reform, right? It's like
Also a Band-Aid.
It's like the defund the police is a Band-Aid.
Oh, that's to me like that was, and that's the worst kind of Band-Aid. It's actually a stupid Band-Aid that cuts into the wound. And I know people get mad at me when I point that out, but I'm like, defund and abolish are not the same thing. For one, like
for one thing,
you could talk to me about the need to completely replace our policing structures and deal with this in an entirely different way. Fine, all right. Given how harmed our society is, it's still going to be hard to do, and it's still going to involve violence. But fine. And you know what? But the worst thing you could possibly do is to defund the people with the goddamn guns, like while they're still in that position. Like, that's insane when you really think about it, because you know who defunded police in the 80s and 90s? Republicans. And it led to an uptick in violence, both from the cops and in the cities that was done in. And I know because I lived through it.
Well, I mean, the point is that it also very often is not addressing the problems that policing is being deployed to deal with. If you have an inner city that's in massive social collapse, you'll have like a warlike situation between the police and the local population, which comes to be seen by the police as like an enemy population, right? Because at the end of the day, what are the police doing? They're like protecting, like they're making sure the violence doesn't spill out to the neighborhoods. You can give them, like Jason Miles wrote this in Sublation, like you can't like racially sensitivity training the violence out of capitalism and the police, right? You have parts of America where there's like virtually no policing. There's no freaking policing in my neighborhood, Varn. I live in a nice neighborhood. I occasionally see a police car coming around. The police are very nice. They found my bike once, which was great. No problem, right? But like you dump like an armed force into the middle of a society in collapse, what the fuck you think is going to happen? You know, the solution to policing is like removing the need for policing, right?
Right.
And obviously, the ultimate way you reduce that is, I guess, you would argue, abolish class society. But like, you know,
but you can remediate it even in a class society. Like, I'm not even going to pretend that you can't.
Yeah, you can. You like if you had a massive public works program in this country, let's say they were like, okay, we're gonna fucking build all the solar panels in America and we're gonna dump a lot of money into it because national security. I don't know, something like that, right? Or they had like, they did, did something like that. You could like build all those freaking factories like in shitty parts of St. Louis and give people jobs and training, right? And you probably wouldn't have as much violence. Right?
It would decrease the violence almost like overnight. It
was you could do things like you could make drugs a little bit more legal and safe. Have a more humane system, focus on rehabilitation. But like ultimately, like the core problem is going to be like, is your society in fucking free fall? Because the means that people can sustain their, like, what the fuck do people think is going to happen in South Chicago? You know, are they going to like fucking have, you can't like community mentor, you know, poor kids from the south side of Chicago out of gang violence en masse, because like gang violence is a product of the fucking economic situation in those neighborhoods.
Right. As I always tell people, even under communism, there's still going to occasionally be horribly violent shit because sociopaths are a thing in the world, but they're pretty goddamn rare. Like except in the high business or whatever. So it's not, you have to deal with the larger social systems. Ironically, one of the studies I saw on gun control actually indicates that gun control works if your society already has strong social safety nets, and if it doesn't, then it doesn't
work. Yeah,
right. I mean, in Britain, let's talk about the stabbings in Britain. You're right, it's better and it's harder to do, but you know what? Under Brexit, y'all gonna look a lot like America.
I mean, yeah, things are getting more like America. It must be all that chlorinated chicken that's going to be imported into the country. It sends people's brains.
It's not that you immiserated yourselves for no fucking reason.
Yeah, it's the chlorinated chicken, and like it's the like. So one of the problem, I mean, like I do like in retrospect. You know, it's like the whole defund the police thing. It's like missing. It all comes down to like, even if you wanted to change this under capitalism, the solution is like a mass public works and welfare program, right?
Right.
But
it's harder politically to do. I mean,
and also neoliberalism has fried everybody's brains, and it's what Ashley Frowley writes about. It's like we live in an era where politics is about changing individuals' bad behaviors, right? Like pathological behaviors, which is just like, you know, it's like it's just a total dead end. There's always going to be an aspect of obviously nurture, right? You know, people get traumatized. You know, like homeless people, the issue is not just about that, you know, like giving them a house and saying, "See ya," right? Like if you've been like on the streets for a long time, chances are there's going to be other like problems that need to be resolved with a person, right? And so this
is what bugged me about the expansion of trauma talk, actually, because the bar for what, and I'm not saying that a lot of this stuff isn't on the spectrum of trauma. Actually, a lot of it is, but there has been a way in which we talk about trauma now that applies to everybody. Everybody, like,
it's like it's like when people talk about violence. It's like somebody in a Kurdish meeting of Kurdish academics was like, somebody said something and somebody was like, "That's violence." I was like, it was like literally only like 30 years ago when they like poison gas people. That's violence. Like that's like being rude, right? You know, like
symbolic violence and actual physical violence.
They like fucking gassed us, man. Like, and now you're whinging because someone like made like a marginally not right comment. Not good.
Well, this is a class issue, though. I mean, like, This is one thing where unfortunately people like Jesse Singal, who I don't love, have a point. The way that we talk about this and the barrier of which we you know, actually this is the point that Freddie DeBoer makes, and Freddie and I do not share a politics in a lot of ways. He's too reformist, actually, and but he wrote about the gentrification of disability. Now, I have issues with some of the things he framed in there, but he's right, for example, that increasingly, for example, in neurodivergence, the people speaking for neurodivergence are socially functional and Ivy League.
Right.
And like, it's not that they're not autistic or are on the spectrum, but it is that they now speak and set the norms for everybody, including people who have trouble functioning in our current society and cannot speak for themselves. Similarly with trauma, like I'm going to out myself. I have severe PTSD. It's bad. All right. And you know what? I'm kind of a violent person. Not going to lie. I am probably on the left, the person voted most likely to stab you. Those are directly related.
Most likely to stab Doug, not anybody.
Well, okay, yeah. I probably wouldn't actually stab Doug. I do have some fondness in my heart for him.
You would be crying while you stabbed him.
Yeah, this is true. But we have to talk about what violence does to people. And I've had long conversations with leftists who are like, revolution tomorrow. And I'm like, okay, well, let's talk about what this means. Anyone who's come from any kind of political violence situation where the stakes are that high, they have done something to themselves that is irreparable. And this is actually some of the, I actually even, like, I'm going to sound liberal on this, but this is even words I have with a lot of revolutionary fetishism. If you think that the violence is the primary thing of the revolution and that's what you need, you're probably going to damage yourself in such a way that you will not produce a functional society once you win. And it's very hard to do. Revolutions are necessary. Political violence is almost inevitable in some way, form, or fashion. But
violence is reactionary. Like,
yeah, it's reactionary making.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, like, I was actually talking about Ben Burgess about this today. I said, like, one of my most squeamishnesses about, like, revolutionary politics is my pessimism about the process of violent revolution, in that on two fronts, it traumatizes people and leaves them, like, it makes it difficult, like, functionally for people to recover from that. It causes them to, it makes hard people. It makes hard people who, might not be, like, well adjusted to the peacetime on one hand. And on the other hand,
paranoid, legitimately. So
legitimately paranoid. And also, it usually ends in the liquidation of the vanguard of the and the people who survive are the opportunists. And so, like, you have like a two. So that's one of the reasons that I am very
Stalin as like the most efficient CEO, right? Like,
exactly.
Like I mean, that's what I read him as. I mean, like, and one of the things that I think I've done that pisses off people who are fans of me, who think I'm, a diehard anti-Stalinist, and in a lot of ways, let's be honest, I kind of am. But I'm always like, no, in the conditions in which Stalin existed, I would have been like Stalin, or I would have been dead. There's only so many ways that can go. You do have to be a special kind of person, of which Lenin may have been one, but also Lenin was someone isolated from the actual violence. Stalin was not. And read about the campaigns in Georgia. It's like he was paranoid for a reason, and that does not produce a functional society. Which is why, in a lot of successful revolutions, what you really want to happen is the people who led the revolution to step back and let someone else lead in peacetime. Like, that's the best case scenario.
I think, on the flip side of this, and like you were talking about, this use of trauma, this use of, talking about neurodivergence.
Oh my God, it's so abused right now.
It's very abused. But also there's a kind of almost cookie cutter approach to people are told they have to be traumatized. It's like, look, people react to things in different ways, right? People, like, someone we both know very well told me, he's like, look, when I was a kid, I got molested by a pedo, right? And he was like, but it's fine. Like, I'm not, like, bothered. Don't cry about it. It was a bit weird, but I got over it, right? Like, people can, some people can recover from things like this. It's like, you're not fucking broken. if something traumatic happens to you, right? Like there's a difference between like, traumatic events that happen as one-offs, right? And like, for example, being like bombed in Syria for like fucking 10 years in a row. Right?
The worst forms of trauma usually are not one-time events. Actually, they're complex events that happen over a series of time.
And some people might be like seriously like affected by that, but not everybody reacts the same way, right?
No, I mean, absolutely not. Trauma does not, like, everyone who's traumatized does not have PTSD.
I don't know this. Like, if I would guess, right, I would guess that like, like maybe like 60-70% of women in America or Britain have been raped or have been.
No, like, I wouldn't say. I would. I think it's probably even the most expansive, something where between 1/5 and 1/4. But yeah, sure.
But I think there's a lot of people out there who don't even like who haven't experienced that could legitimately be described as being raped, but they like it just didn't affect them in the same way as it affects other people, and so they didn't like process it in that way, if that makes sense. They had like a sexual encounter, like obviously I think there's this kind of weird like kind of like attempting to create like a progressive sexual etiquette that's taking place, which I think is ultimately a futile thing. But I think, and I think there's a difference between like an uncomfortable sexual encounter that you're like, ooh, maybe I shouldn't have done that, like a couple of days later, and a rape. But I think there were like, taking those things aside, I think like there are, many people who have like suffered under this system. But I think people process it different. But I think there's like there's a kind of a trauma business that's out there to try and get people and trying to get people to like relive traumas that and try and like root the problems that they have in their particular traumas, if that makes sense.
Well, I had this realization when we started talking about like trauma-based pedagogy, right? Something like 50% of most high school students have been exposed to something that is likely to produce some kind of trauma response.
Right.
Guess what? Trauma-based pedagogy has shown no efficacy on the results of that. And if anything, it seems to show efficacy in the other direction. So what we see is the expansion of people's non-functionability due to trauma, expansion of anxiety disorders, expansion of depression. Meaning that it is a chicken or the egg scenario, but you have a hard time convincing me that things are more traumatic now than say in the 1970s, where violence in America was actually higher than it is now. Even now.
Mm-hmm.
Our cultural threshold for what we consider traumatic has
changed.
Dramatically changed. Like, but and I'm also often when I hear people talking about trauma, I'm the only person in the room with several stab wounds.
Yeah, I mean
I bring it up a lot these days because I'm like, perspective, you need it. Like,
it's like this. It's like, look, maybe this is a little bit folksy for the old left media, but I have a 3-year-old. When he falls over, right? If I run up to him and start going, "Oh no, are you okay?" It makes it worse, right? If I ignore him, and it makes it worse. Not that I ignore him, but he falls over and he starts crying.
Yeah, you don't give him any support. It also is bad.
So bad. Like, but if I go up to him and go, "Hey, it's okay, buddy. Yeah, that's pretty bad. Come on, let's go. Like, it's okay. Don't worry about it." If I try and like hit that balance between saying, "Hey, it's like not good. You're right to be sad, but let's just chill down." He'll calm down, right? Like, so if you're like permanently trying to get people to like face their trauma or like, accept it, it's like maybe for some people, just like putting it to the back of the mind and just like going like, it was a bad experience. Don't want to do that again, right? Maybe that's just the best approach for some people. I don't know. I don't know if there's a one size fits all for everybody, but definitely there's a whole like kind of fucking, and I think it's kind of almost like a, it's almost like a, I don't know. I don't even know how to describe it. It's like, obviously you don't want to live in a society where no one can talk about like the problems that people have, but there's a kind of neuroses about a kind of middle class neuroses. It's like the racism stuff. It's like where you have to like permanently go talk about like as a white
I was
person.
listening to it in NPR today. It's like we have to talk about our trauma, our generational trauma, our depression. We have to talk about it out loud. And I was like, look, okay, I just want to tell you, there's a generation of poets. All right, and there was a poet actually I was listening to talking about this. I won't name who she was because I'm being slightly derivative, and I actually like her work. But that generation of poets that we call them the confessional poets. You know what they all share? About 60% of them committed suicide. I don't know that this form of therapy is always helpful. And I also don't know that therapy should be performed publicly as a ritual. Like, and it's a weird thing to say, but on one hand, there is a kind of macho culture on some parts of the left that doesn't want to deal with this at all, or wants to pretend that this is all like PMC, conspiracies, basically, to make us weak. On the other hand, there's like a ritual, like reclamation and declaration of this.
It's very self-indulgent. It's like very self-indulgent.
It really is.
It's like, look, man, it's like, I'm sorry that your dad shouted at you and was kind of a dick, right? Like, that's not great, right? That's going to affect you. Like, I get it. But, like, it becomes an excuse for people. I don't know. Mm-hmm. It just feels, and maybe this is my conservative side, Varn. It feels undignified. And it feels like a kind of like, it feels like a kind of, I think you're right, like it's a kind of ritual. And it's almost like the racism training that where like you have to like confess your racism and then go back to Ibrahim Kendi to get another indulgence at some point, right? It's like you have to get a mental health, you like all your negative feelings, right, are processed as being like a problem, right? And like it's all linked to trauma. When in fact, right, like people have negative feelings, right?
Yeah, I was an asshole before I was traumatized.
Yeah, I mean, like, and you're still an asshole now. So exactly. It's like, it's fine. Sometimes you feel sad, right? Like being a bit sad, right? Or being a bit angry, A, is like normal. It's normal. And B, it could be that the problem isn't you, but there's like external factors to you that make you angry, right?
I mean, I think there's a whole lot of complications on this. And one of the, like, I say this as a person who probably is like, when you think of soldier-like PTSD, not being able to sleep, outbursts, etc., I have it. I actually don't really have the violent inclination with people I care about. But if you're on the street and you approach me and I think you're dangerous, like, there is a small possibility I deck you because you're there. And that's
you get a Varn flog, not a Varn vlog.
It's something that I've had to train out of myself systemically. And one of the things I think about that is I think a lot of the kind of indulgence that I've seen, and again, I'm just speaking for me here, would actually cut against the kind of things I'd have to do to not engage in the most irrational behavior that is associated with trauma-induced paranoia. Like, and, it's not healthy. It's not great. but it's also not the worst thing in the fucking world. And as I said, don't put me in charge of society.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, when people think I'm joking when I'm like, I'd be super Stalin, but I don't think I'm joking. I think I probably would. I'd be like, nope, that guy's trying to get me. That guy's trying to get me. That guy's a dick. We got to get rid of him. What I would not be is super Beria, but that's a whole different story.
Who would be super barrier?
Yeah, well, I mean, if you're calling someone super Beria, you're calling them a rapist and a pederast. So, I mean, which in our society apparently is the worst thing you can be. I think in most societies it's pretty bad, but I do sometimes I have wondered, we are in the United States right now, we are more likely to forgive murder than sexual violence.
It's an interesting thing, isn't it? I've often thought of that too. So that's kind of a interesting way to frame things. It's like you hear about this in prison. Maybe it's a myth, but it's like, the guy who stabbed 30 people to death is acting all morally superior to the guy who exposed himself.
And that's absolutely true. I can say this as a former prison guard. That is real. And honestly, even my own response is that way. I'm like, murderer. I mean, they're bad. But
not
but pederast.
Something I'm like, what about child murderer, but not pederast?
Oh, that's tough, actually. I think on me. I mean, not to weigh the horribleness of horrible actions, because in some ways you can't. But my natural response is, okay, child murderer and pet. But that's my thought. Is they're the same? And I think what is that? I mean, I don't know. Is that natural? I mean, we're really, it's late. We're delving into psychoanalysis here.
I know.
But,
I don't think you're right in the head if you are just cool with raping kids.
No, I don't.
You're just not right in the head if you think if you don't have an instinctive revulsion to that. I mean, with something like murder, it can be deeply contextualized. There could be a situation where it's totally justifiable.
Yeah, but murdering kids is not one of them. I can't.
Murdering
would ever be justified to murder a kid.
Murdering kids and sexually assaulting people. I don't know. It's not really.
Maybe that's it. Maybe it's the fact that it's hard. You can't really imagine a strategic calculus where that makes sense.
It's just pure barbarism to many people, I think.
Right. But I do have issues with when we're talking about someone who's murdered 30 people, and I'm like, yeah, that's not that. I don't know.
That's not he got mad because the guy picked a fight with him in a bar and he accidentally punched him and he banged his head on the floor. That's
right.
Murdered and cut up 30 people. I mean, it's there's some sick shit people do to each other.
Oh yeah.
There's some really, which some of it's sexual, some of it's not sexual. But of course, the sexual stuff is very weird because it's a violation of a certain intimacy. I'm sure there's so much literature on it.
One of the things that I always, when we talked about the revolutionary stuff, I'm like, do you have any idea what you are unleashing when you start letting that happen? And
yes, you 100%. People don't know what war is. It's not just it's a lot of rape, right?
Yeah, it's a whole lot of it, and there's
a whole lot of rape, a whole lot of traumatized
children who are never going to be okay. I mean, I remember, even in a situation like, say, Palestine, I saw a Palestinian refugee in Egypt who I just tripped over the fact that she had watched her aunt and uncle be shot by the IDF, straight up, and just sitting there trying to deal and like I said, I have experience with trauma. I have experience with violent trauma. I don't know how to respond to a child in that scenario. And and weirdly, as a teacher, it happens unfortunately more than you think.
Mm-hmm.
I've at least taught I've taught thousands of kids, but I've at least taught 20 kids who have seen someone murdered in my life, for sure, 100%. I mean, I know it. Like, I've had conversations with them sometimes, and the responses are varied. But you know what I find interesting is none of the stuff I'm seeing in the discourse about trauma has really helped me with any of that at all. Like, it's still just as impossible to deal with now after I've dealt with it 20 times as it was time one.
I guess this is why I think we got to we're having a good therapy session here, Doug.
Yeah, the last 45 minutes we've been off the rails.
Off the rails. But that's one of the reasons I find like revolutionary war LARPing as like very distasteful, because it's like not something to be celebrated.
No,
it's a tragedy. It's like the Bolshevik Revolution, like 1917, November 1917, was a peaceful revolution, right? The Bolsheviks walked into power, right?
Yeah. The Civil War was a traumatizing event.
The Civil War was the traumatizing event, exactly. And like, I don't know if you read Bashkar's book, the Socialist Manifesto book that he did, but you know, obviously he has this whole like I don't know, speculative fiction of like how socialism would come into being in America, and a kind of like electoral revolution. I would like for that to be a realistic vision, but you know, I feel like, you know, like the violence, like like bearable levels of violence will be imposed upon people. We're really, you know, like that's what it, you know, that's what a lot of it comes down to, right? It's like we're desperately seeking a strategy that
will minimize the violence.
That will minimize the violence.
Like,
and people,
even me, who's pro-revolutionary, I am very much, you have to minimize. If you engage in violence for violence sake, you are undoing your fucking society. Like,
I mean, like the ideal society, the ideal road to socialism would you could have an election, you could call a constitutional convention, you could throw out the old constitution and like build socialism through
the McNair strategy, right? Which you make all the other oppositions unthinkable without an extreme level of violence.
Yeah.
You know, I don't see that. The thing is, I don't really see that in the cards. Like,
yeah, but you know, exactly, and I don't see like a violent revolution on the cards either.
No. Like the people talk about like some kind of like France style insurrection against a nuclear armed state. It's just like, it's you know, and I don't just mean it because, oh well, they won't nuke us. I'm like, yeah, but they're not going to do.
I mean, this is partly why I'm like sympathetic to like DSA, as even though I'm like very skeptical about the tactics, is that, well, you know, like what else is, you know, what else are we doing? You know, like what
the socialists that I meet that scare me are the socialists who are like not just admitting that almost all this has to deal with civil war, but that seem to want it.
Yeah, who want to fucking,
that's insane.
Well,
like,
they want to dress up in a fucking Red Army uniform and fucking lap around. That's what they want to do. I mean, somebody showed us a meme today where it was I don't know if you noticed the meme that someone shared with us on Twitter, which was like, here's the like Russian left, here's the Asian left, here's the Middle Eastern left, and it's just all
Samir Khan who was sharing it.
Yeah, and it's all just people in military fatigues, right?
Right. It's military fatigue, which I'm
it's
like,
not,
one, that's not even what the Asian left is like anymore. But two, like, it's like, A, that's LARPing, and B, it's I mean, it's weird because some of the same people will also be like, see, China's better to its trans people than the West. And I'm like, So you want to have it both ways on this, but let's parse this for a second, because there's actually been there's been an internal fight in the CPC about culture issues. There was a pushback in the beginning of the Red New Deal, and that's been kind of reversed a little bit in the last few years back towards a more tolerant policy. But there are people within the CPC who totally believe that that all this sexuality stuff is bourgeois deviation, and which, by the way, is a historical solidist position on it, reversing Lenin's position on it even. Mm-hmm. So it's, I'm not saying one way or the other, but it seems to be this projection of militancy as the form of a successful left, militancy that wears a uniform and wears a uniform from 100 years ago, by the way. Mm-hmm. That really isn't true to anywhere in the world now, and then situates it to some place you can project upon that isn't here, right? So you can imagine there's this military heroic thing really at the base of all this, in which you can appeal to, but it's elsewhere. Which was, my response to someone was like, well, tankies have tanks. I'm like, well, no, they don't actually. Like, yeah, China has tanks, but I promise you, functionaries in the PRC are not fucking tankies. Like,
and they're not fucking driving the tanks either.
No. And, there's other stuff I could point out to you, like that China doesn't have a blue water military, and even Navy in India does. Like, which also is kind of an argument against the imperialism. The people choose China being like somehow hyper imperialist. I'm like, well, they don't have a blue water navy, so no, they aren't. But there's this whole sense in which all this is projection, right? And it is from people who, by and large, do not know violence. And that actually, we've been going through the therapy session, but I think that's important to get to, because if you do know violence, you're not happy about this 90% of the time. Like, most of the soldiers I know, even the right-wing ones, are not usually people who are super pro-violence.
There's always a minority of people who just love it. They love
and they would in any scenario.
But the majority of people, it's like being in the military is pretty traumatic for a variety of reasons, right? And
the military sucks. Look, the kind of discipline it takes to go through military training, rightfully, is not something that a lot of people can undo or recover from. Like, it does certain things to you.
You're like, I have a relative who is in the American military, and he was a sergeant, and he said his main job is stopping 18-year-olds from crying all the time because they're all so miserable, right? Yeah. It's like you go to.
And this, by the way, people just it's America's a soft society, and I actually do think America is a soft society. But guess what? That's always true. Like, you can go back and read stuff from the quote greatest generation, aka the hard asses from 100 years ago, who were kind of probably quasi psychopaths by the conditions of early American poverty in the United States, who lived through the Long Depression and then into the Great Depression. Those people were hard, and they still broke down crying all the goddamn time. It's not normal for people to do that. Even warrior societies are hard to maintain. They are. We are not a species that really revels in killing a bunch of each other that much.
And if you do, you're probably not mentally healthy, right?
Right.
There's it's just clearly not a great evolutionary advantage for people to just want to fucking murder each other all the time, is there?
No, and even when you get into like the genetics of it, which I know is something that leftists are not supposed to do, but I do this to like point out a point. Like there's a gene marker that codes for violence. But you know what's interesting about it? It only codes for violence in certain people who have it if they experience certain kinds of trauma that actually produce hormone responses that trigger the gene response. So this is what even when I deal with genetic determinists who talk about this stuff, I'm like, yeah, but guess what? These things have environmental triggers. They don't go off just on their own in most people who have them. Like people, even with predispositions to violent responses, are not born usually murderous assholes. Like something has to happen to trigger that.
Yeah. I mean, like and it's like, like even the people, many of these like leftists who are fetishizing the violence, even if they've experienced like personal violence, like one-to-one violence, it's not even quite the same as like experiencing the violence of war.
No.
As well. So like living in a rough neighborhood perhaps and getting beaten up a couple of times, that's like not a good experience. I'm not saying that's like, oh, suck it up, chump, because you don't live in Cambodia. But it's still like there's a fucking bit of a difference between that and like the mass violence involved in war.
Yeah, I mean, I think about what I have seen is like the mass violence of a cartel war, and then like refugees from Syria and people who actually survived the street violence of the revolution and counter-revolution in Egypt. And even that is hard for the average American to really comprehend.
Yeah.
Like, and it changes you to see it. Now, it doesn't change everybody the same way. Like, that's important.
And there are places in America where you do have like comparable levels of violence.
Sure.
But that's not where these fucking
Chicago,
But that's not where these fucking lefties were raised.
No.
They were raised in the suburbs.
Or in Brooklyn I mean, and I'm of two minds about that actually. There is, like you said it yourself actually early on, violence is reactionary making, and that's even down to like, we know that from psychological studies even. Like people who have experienced violence, it is a conservatizing force in their life.
Mm-hmm.
It isn't mine. Like all my worst, most conservative impulses come from my response to this. It is not like the two things that are conservatizing in my life. One is being working class and actually getting ahead. Was not something that primed me to be a leftist. It actually primed me to be opposite, because it's just like, well, why can't they do it?
Right.
I struggle my ass off. And so there's that. All right. You have to battle that. But then also, like, the violent shit makes, it leads to things like paranoia, or you need to be hard and you can't tolerate shit and you can't be forgiving. And what's all this lefty, lovey-dovey, huggy shit? Like, and I have to, I actually think, I don't think that's a good reaction to me. I think that is fundamentally unhealthy. Like, I do have it. It's there.
I totally agree. I think violence will mess you up. You will get messed up by having violent experiences, and it will be an unpleasant experience for you, and will have long-term psychological problems. Right. That seems at variance with what I was saying about like people self-indulging their trauma, but I think there is a difference. Like people have traumatic experiences in their life. It's not the end of the fucking world. Don't make people feel like they're broken permanently. People can get over things, but there are some sustained traumas which are very difficult for people to get over. So like, it's not to minimize traumatic experiences that people have, but we have to, like, we don't need to like valorize people having trauma. We need to help people. We don't need to. It's like the difference between trying to solve a problem with one medical solution and then putting someone on kind of drugs for life.
Right.
People might have a traumatic experience, but hey, like they talk to somebody, they get a bit of therapy, they get told, like they get helped. And then like they're like, it's cool. Like you're not broken, you're not damaged. There's nothing wrong with you. You don't need to be scared of people. Like you can help people. You can help people get through those things. Don't make them feel like they have to feel weird about this. And this probably isn't even an issue with like trained psychiatrists or psychologists dealing with these people. This is, I think, a kind of societal.
It's the appropriate. I actually talk a lot to my partner about this because we have fights about it. But I'm like, I don't have a problem with therapy. I have a problem with the appropriation of therapy for political reasons. Mm-hmm. Like, I think I'm skeptical of certain kinds of therapies. This is beyond the purview of this show. We've been talking for 3 hours. I'm not going to go into that. But I do think therapy is not a bad thing for people who need it. The problem that I have is taking those norms under clinical conditions of care and trying to build entire social relations and the way we interact with each other around them. Like,
and also trying to professionalize like difficulties you have in your life. Like sometimes, like having a good network of friends to just help you through a problem, you don't need a fucking professional to help. Like if you're having a bad time at work, maybe talk to your friends about it, right? If you're like freaking sexually assaulted at the gym, yeah, like, okay, maybe like that's when you go to therapy. But like having like a difficult decision,
Yeah, it does seem a little odd to me. We've been like, everybody needs therapy. Then I'm like, well, then I know we're trying to remove stigma from mental health, and I know we're trying to deal with the fact that mental health problems are more ubiquitous, particularly in our crumbling society. But, which, I have finally seen people who push back on me on the crumbling society part get on the train on this. Because when I said this like 4 or 5 years ago, even, they were like, well, that's reactionary, Derek. Society is not crumbling. Go read Steven Pinker.
Ooh.
Blink, 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 blink.
No, read Malcolm Gladwell. You'll enjoy it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I do think that whole period of like positive psychology shit that dominated from like 2000 to like 2005, Daniel Bessner was talking, to like 2016 is, I'm glad that's over. Mm-hmm. But there is a case where like engaging in some of this really makes me worried. One of the things that I worry about myself, because I have doomer tendencies, and I'm always trying to parse, is this me being analytic or is this me being paranoid? Like,
well, my doomer tendencies are analytic because I'm a chirpy person. I'm happy. I'm a happy person, but I also can tell that we're doomed.
I mean, well, yeah, that's good. I feel like when Djene Bajalan is like, well, Derek is not being ridiculous. It's usually it's maybe a good time for me and a bad time for the world. But it's interesting because I've always, what's funny though, I actually kind of reject a lot of doomer politics. Like I remember in 2007, 2008, everybody was like, peak oil, civilization's doomed. And I'm like, well, civilization may be doomed and we are going to run out of oil and we're probably at peak oil, but like, it's not going to be what you think it's going to be. Like nothing's ever that quick or that obvious or that clear or that, like, it's not an event. There's not going to be like a day where we wake up, we're in the 19th century. Like, that's not how things happen. Like, collapses take a long time.
Unless there's a meteor strike.
Yeah, like, well, that'll do it. Yes,
that'll do it.
But then we're not waking up in the 19th century. We're waking up like not at all.
Not at all, exactly. But we have been
way out.
We have been going for 3 hours.
Let's go to bed. It's
been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. people should check out Sublation magazine. It's not all Doug Lane. In fact, Doug Lane is like just on the board of that. He's actually not editorially involved that much.
No, he's not that involved. He like occasionally forces us to publish something that he wants, but you know, it's fine. It's yeah. So people check out Sublation magazine. Yes, sometimes we're going to publish someone that you don't like. It's fine. Sometimes we'll publish someone you do like, and we can all play a game, which is who commissioned what.
Yeah, which is a fun game that we do play. Where I'm like, I think this is this editor, and then Gene's like, you're wrong about that. I'm like, damn it.
So yeah, and check out check out the Sublation magazine show on Mondays that we do as well. So
I've been a guest on it.
Yep, Varn's been a guest on it, and he will be a guest on it again, hopefully at one point when he writes his next article. I want to be the sole purveyor of Varn produce.
You're just the only person who bugs me enough to get me actually write something. Like, you bug me.
I bug him.
Yeah. Everybody else is like, well, Varn, when you feel like it, you can write an article, which is the way, like, I'm never going to fucking do that. Like, that's not going to happen. I hate writing. I'm going to write a poem.
That's another problem with the American left, but we won't get into that right now.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Well, yeah. And check out TIR and all that good stuff. And
TIR's been on fire lately.
And gaming materialists, we're gonna have. Well, we'll when this comes out, will this be in the past?
No, it'll be right. I think it'll be right before the next episode of Gaming Materialists comes out. So
okay, we've got Discourse. Discourse is back on Gaming Materialist, and we're gonna talk about Warhammer Fantasy. So yeah, keep it real, people.
All right, take care. And I'm gonna end on another video that Djene made.